My son-in-law did not know I owned the company he works for as CEO. He always thought I was just a simple old woman. I kept my true identity a secret from him and his snobby family until the day he cheated and slapped my daughter. 2 minutes later, his entire world collapsed. My name is Evelyn Sterling. I am 62 years old, and for the past 7 years, I have lived a double life. To my daughter Maya, I am just her loving mother who enjoys tending to my garden and driving a 10-year-old Honda SUV. To my son-in-law, Preston, I am a poor woman from the south side of Atlanta who should be eternally grateful that a wealthy, successful white man decided to marry into her family. But to the financial world, I am the founder and sole owner of Sterling Vanguard, a private equity firm worth billions. Before I take you into the master bedroom where everything shattered, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Have you ever had someone mistake your silence for weakness? Hit the like button and subscribe if you believe that karma is best served cold and with a side of absolute financial ruin. It was a warm Saturday evening in Atlanta. We were gathered at Preston and Maya's sprawling mansion in Buckhead to celebrate their 5th wedding anniversary. The house was overflowing with Atlanta corporate elite. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with trays of expensive champagne and delicate appetizers. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the carefully curated crowd. Preston was holding court in the center of the living room, laughing loudly with his fellow executives from Lumina Innovations, the tech company where he served as chief executive officer. He wore a custom-tailored suit and held his glass like a king looking over his kingdom. I stood quietly in the corner near a massive floral arrangement wearing a simple off-the-rack floral dress. I blended right into the wallpaper exactly how Preston liked it. He preferred me invisible, only acknowledging me when he wanted to make a patronizing comment about how nice it was that Maya could move my mother out of the rough neighborhoods. He never knew that I had quietly purchased Lumina Innovations through a proxy holding company 3 years ago. He was technically my employee, but I let him play boss because Maya loved him. Maya looked absolutely breathtaking that night. She wore an elegant emerald green gown that complemented her beautiful brown skin. She had spent weeks planning this perfect evening to celebrate their milestone. She had supported Preston when he was just a mid-level manager, sacrificing her own dreams of expanding her community art center so they could focus on him climbing the corporate ladder. Now that he was at the top, he treated her more like an accessory than a partner. Around 9 o'clock, I noticed Maya looking around the crowded room with a slight frown. Preston had vanished. So had Chloe, his newly appointed 28-year-old vice president of marketing. Chloe was a tall blonde woman who had spent the entire evening trailing after Preston, laughing a little too loudly at his jokes and touching his arm with a familiarity that made my motherly instincts scream. I watched Maya excuse herself from a group of wives and head toward the sweeping grand staircase. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I set my sparkling water down on a passing tray and quietly followed my daughter upstairs. The heavy thumping of the bass from the string quartet playing modern pop songs downstairs faded as we reached the 2nd floor. The hallway was lined with expensive modern art that Preston insisted on buying, even though Maya was the actual artist in the family. I stayed a few paces behind Maya, not wanting to hover, but wanting to be there just in case. The door to the master suite was slightly ajar. A sliver of warm light spilled out onto the dark hardwood floor. I saw Maya freeze. Her hand hovered over the silver doorknob. The sound of muffled laughter and whispers drifted from inside the room. It was not the kind of laughter you share over a private joke. It was intimate. It was a betrayal. Maya pushed the door open. I took a step forward, my heart breaking as I saw my daughter stiffen. Through the doorway, the scene was undeniably clear. There was Preston, the man who had stood before God and our family vowing to protect and cherish my daughter, half undressed on the edge of their custom California king bed. And there was Chloe, her expensive designer dress pooled on the floor, her hands tangled in his hair. Maya gasped. It was a sharp, painful sound that sucked all the air out of the room. Preston jumped up, his face flashing with panic for exactly 1 second before his features hardened into that familiar mask of corporate arrogance. Chloe did not even have the decency to look ashamed. She slowly picked up her dress, clutching it to her chest, with a smug little smile playing on her lips, as if she had just won a prize. "What are you doing?" Maya whispered, her voice trembling. Her beautiful green dress suddenly looked too heavy for her delicate frame. "How could you do this in our home, at our anniversary party?" I stayed hidden in the shadows of the hallway, my fists clenching so hard my fingernails dug into my palms. I wanted to storm in and tear him apart, but I needed to see how Preston would handle his own failure. I needed to see the true measure of the man my daughter married. Instead of dropping to his knees and begging for forgiveness, Preston sighed. He casually buttoned his dress shirt, acting as if Maya had just interrupted a mundane business meeting. "Oh, please, Maya, do not make a scene," he said, rolling his eyes. "You have been acting so cold lately. You are obsessed with that little community art project of yours. You are boring, Maya. You do not understand the pressure I am under at Lumina. Chloe understands. She is on my level." The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow. He was gaslighting her. He was standing in the bedroom my daughter had painstakingly decorated, caught in the most humiliating act of betrayal, and he was blaming her for his complete lack of morals. Maya stepped fully into the room, her sadness rapidly turning into a fierce, righteous anger. Her tears dried instantly. "I am boring," she repeated, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "I am the reason you are dragging some cheap corporate climber into our marital bed. No, Preston, you are just a coward who needs constant validation." Chloe scoffed, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. "Watch how you speak to him, Maya. He is the CEO. You are just a housewife spending his money." Maya ignored her entirely, keeping her blazing eyes locked on her husband. "You disgust me," she told him. "Get your clothes on. We are going downstairs right now. You are going to take the microphone and you are going to tell all your investors, your board members, and your snobby parents exactly why this marriage is over. If you do not tell them, I will." Preston lost his arrogant smirk. The threat of public humiliation, the threat to his precious image, struck a nerve. He took 2 large, aggressive steps toward my daughter. His face was red, his veins bulging against his stiff collar. "You will not say a damn word to anyone," he hissed, towering over her. "I built this life for you. You are nothing without me. Do you hear me? Nothing. I am done protecting your fragile ego." Maya fired back, not backing down an inch. And then it happened. The sound echoed in the large, high-ceilinged room like a gunshot. Preston swung his hand and slapped my daughter hard across her face. The force of the blow snapped Maya's head to the side. She stumbled backward, crashing into the heavy mahogany dresser. A framed wedding photo fell to the floor, the glass shattering into 100 jagged pieces. Maya held her hand to her cheek, her eyes wide with absolute shock. Time seemed to stop. The air in the room grew freezing cold. The man I had tolerated for 5 years had just crossed a line that could never, ever be uncrossed. I stepped out of the shadows and walked into the master suite. My footsteps crunched softly on the broken glass of their wedding photo. Preston spun around, breathing heavily. For a second, he looked surprised to see me, but that surprise quickly morphed back into his standard dripping condescension. "Evelyn," he spat out, sneering at my simple floral dress. "Do not even think about getting involved in this. This is between a husband and a wife. You should have stayed downstairs with the catering staff where you belong." I did not yell. I did not scream. True power never has to raise its voice. I walked past him, completely ignoring his existence, and went straight to my daughter. I gently touched Maya on the shoulder. She looked at me, a single tear escaping her eye, a red mark blooming on her beautiful cheek. "Are you okay, baby girl?" I asked softly. Maya nodded slowly, standing up straight, her dignity intact despite the violent assault. I turned to face Preston. He was standing there, puffed up with false authority, convinced that he held all the cards. He thought he was looking at a helpless, poor, older woman who relied on his charity to survive. "What are you going to do?" Old Lady Preston scoffed, crossing his arms over his chest. "Call the cops." "Go ahead. Who do you think the police in Buckhead are going to believe? A respected tech CEO or some nobody from the South Side? Run along to the kitchen and bake me a pie. You and your daughter are both getting thrown out of my house tonight." I stared into his pale blue eyes, feeling an absolute icy calm wash over me. I reached into my simple leather purse and pulled out my cell phone. I did not break eye contact with him as I tapped the screen. I opened my secure messaging app and sent a single text to my lead wealth manager at Sterling Vanguard. The text read, "Initiate Protocol 0 on Lumina Innovations. Freeze his personal assets by morning." I slid the phone back into my purse. The room was dead silent, save for the distant thumping of the party music downstairs. I looked at Preston, who was still wearing that smug, untouchable grin. I let a small, dangerous smile touch my own lips. "You just signed your own death warrant, little boy," I said quietly. My voice was completely steady, carrying the weight of $1 billion empire he had no idea he had just gone to war with. The heavy sound of hurried footsteps echoed from the hallway, shattering the tense silence that had fallen over the master bedroom. 2 figures rushed through the doorway. It was Richard and Susan Whitman Preston's parents. They had undoubtedly heard the sound of the slap and the breaking glass from the staircase. Richard was a tall man with a permanent scowl who carried his inherited wealth like a weapon. Susan was dripping in pearls and old money arrogance, wearing a tight silver gown that made her look more like a snake than a mother-in-law. They stopped in their tracks as they took in the scene. The shattered wedding photograph on the floor. Chloe standing near the bed, clutching her ruined dress. Preston breathing heavily, with a red mark beginning to form where he had struck my daughter. And Maya standing tall, with tears shining in her eyes, but her chin held high. I stood right beside her, an invisible shield in my cheap floral dress. A normal mother would have rushed to her daughter-in-law. A normal mother would have slapped her own son for raising a hand to a woman. But Susan Whitman was not a normal mother. She was a woman who believed that wealth excused all sins as long as those sins were committed by a white man with a trust fund. Susan did not look at Preston. She did not look at the mistress. She locked her cold gray eyes directly on Maya and sighed a long, exaggerated sigh of pure disappointment. "Maya, what on earth are you doing making a scene like this?" Susan demanded, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. "We have important investors downstairs. The governor is drinking champagne in our living room, and you are up here throwing a hysterical fit over a meaningless indiscretion." I felt Maya stiffen beside me. "A hysterical fit," she repeated, her voice trembling with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Your son just slapped me, Susan. He brought another woman into our marital bed on our anniversary, and he hit me when I confronted him." Susan waved her hand in the air, completely dismissing the violence, as if Maya had complained about a spilled drink. "Oh, please, Maya, do not exaggerate," Susan scoffed, stepping further into the room and carefully avoiding the broken glass. Preston works under immense pressure. He is the chief executive officer of a major technology firm. Men in his position have needs, and sometimes they make small mistakes. You are his wife. Your job is to support him, not embarrass him in front of his colleagues. You should be grateful he even comes home to you." Richard finally spoke up, his voice booming with entitled authority. "My wife is right, Maya. You are acting completely irrational. Preston is a provider. He gives you everything. You live in a $10 million mansion. You drive a luxury car. You do not have to work a real job. If you had any sense, you would apologize to your husband for ruining his anniversary party and go wash your face." I stood there listening to these people tear down my beautiful, intelligent daughter. My blood was boiling so hot I thought I might burst into flames, but I kept my face completely blank. I needed them to show their entire hand. I needed to see exactly how deep their rot went. Maya shook her head, staring at the people she had called family for 5 years as if they were aliens. "Apologize to him," she asked in disbelief. "You want me to apologize to the man who just cheated on me and assaulted me?" Susan took a step closer to Maya, looking her up and down with a sneer that made my stomach turn. "Let us be brutally honest here, Maya. Preston elevated you. Before he came along and rescued you from that pathetic little life of yours, you and your mother were just scraping by in the South Side. You were a public school teacher making pennies. We welcomed you into our society. We gave you a name that actually means something in this city. Do not throw away this entire lifestyle over a minor mistake. You will never find another man like Preston. You will end up right back in the ghetto where you came from." The sheer racism and classism in her words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Susan looked at me for the first time, her eyes full of pity and disgust. "Tell your daughter to behave, Evelyn. Tell her how cold the real world is for people like you. Make yourself useful for once." I looked calmly at Susan. I did not raise my voice. I did not react to her venom. I simply said, "The real world is indeed very cold, Susan. You have absolutely no idea how cold it is about to get." Preston seemed completely energized by his parents defending him. The brief moment of panic he had shown when I first walked in was entirely gone. He puffed out his chest and walked toward Maya, acting like a king who had just crushed a peasant rebellion. "You heard my mother, Maya," he sneered. "You are done here. I am sick of your attitude, and I am sick of your boring charity projects. If you want to play the victim, you can do it somewhere else." "Get out of my house!" "Your house," Maya fired back. "This is our home, Preston. Half of this belongs to me." Preston laughed a cruel barking sound that made my jaw clench. "Nothing belongs to you," he spat. "I pay the mortgage. I pay for your little art center. I pay for the clothes on your back. You think you can threaten me and stay under my roof? Get out, both of you. Take your trailer park mother and get out of my sight before I have security drag you out by your hair." He pulled his expensive smartphone from his pocket and tapped the screen furiously. "You want to see how much power you really have?" he mocked, glaring at Maya. "I am logging into the bank portal right now. I am freezing the joint checking account. I am canceling the platinum credit cards. I am removing your access to the investment portfolios. Let us see how long your righteous anger lasts when you cannot even afford to buy a cup of coffee tomorrow morning." He held up his phone, showing the screen where the account access had been instantly revoked. "You are officially cut off, Maya. You have nothing. Now get out." I gently placed my hand on the small of Maya's back. "We do not need to stay here and listen to this baby girl," I whispered to her. "Let them have this room. It is already tainted." Maya took one last look at her husband. She looked at Chloe, who was now smirking triumphantly from the corner of the room. She looked at Richard and Susan, who stood shoulder to shoulder in their arrogant delusion. Then she turned her back on all of them. We walked out of the master suite together. We walked down the grand staircase while the string quartet continued to play upbeat music. The party guests stared at us, whispering behind their champagne glasses, as we made our way to the massive front doors. Preston had already signaled his security team because two large men in black suits escorted us down the driveway like we were criminals. The warm Atlanta night air hit us as we walked down the long, winding driveway away from the mansion. The valet brought around my 10-year-old Honda Sport utility vehicle. It looked completely out of place among the rows of imported luxury cars, but to me, it was a perfect disguise. We climbed into the car, the heavy doors shut, locking out the noise of the party. The moment we were enclosed in the quiet privacy of the old vehicle, Maya's strong facade finally cracked. She slumped into the passenger seat and buried her face in her hands. Deep, agonizing sobs tore from her chest. I started the engine, but I did not put the car in drive. I just sat there, letting her cry out the pain of a 5-year betrayal. I rubbed her back, feeling the tension in her shaking shoulders. "Mom, what am I going to do?" she cried, her voice muffled by her hands. "He took everything. He took my home. He took my dignity. I gave him 5 years of my life. I supported him when nobody else believed in his vision. I built that man from the ground up, and he just threw me away like trash." She looked up at me, her beautiful eyes red and swollen. "I have nothing left, Mom." He froze the accounts. He was right. I am completely broke. I cannot even pay the rent for the community art center next month. He is going to ruin me. He has all the money and all the lawyers. I have absolutely nothing. I let her finish. I let her express every ounce of fear and despair that Preston had deliberately planted in her mind. Then I reached over and turned on the overhead cabin light. I opened my simple worn leather purse. I bypassed the coupons and the grocery receipts. I reached into a hidden zippered compartment and pulled out a small, sleek black leather card holder. I opened it and slid out a heavy metal card. It was a black American Express Centurion card. The kind of card that requires tens of millions of dollars in personal spending just to receive an invitation. It was issued directly under the name Sterling Vanguard Holding Corporation. I took Maya's trembling hand and pressed the heavy metal card firmly into her palm. She looked down at the black card in confusion. The overhead light caught the silver lettering. She blinked, trying to process what she was holding. "Mom, what is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Whose card is this?" I smiled warmly at my beautiful, brilliant daughter. I reached out and wiped a stray tear from her cheek. "It is yours," I said, my voice steady and completely calm. Maya shook her head, still not understanding. "But Mom, how can you have this? You drive this old car. You clip coupons." Preston said I have nothing. He said he owns everything. My smile slowly faded, replaced by the cold, calculating focus of a woman who had spent decades destroying ruthless men in corporate boardrooms. "Preston is a fool," I told her softly. "He thinks he holds the power because he wears an expensive suit and sits in a corner office that I bought for him. He thinks wealth is about showing off to politicians at a dinner party. He has absolutely no idea who I really am, Maya, and he has no idea who you are." I started the car and shifted it into drive, the engine humming quietly in the dark. "Baby girl, you own the bank," I said, looking back toward the glowing mansion in the rearview mirror. "Now let him dig his grave." As we pulled out of the massive iron gates of the neighborhood, I let the silence settle between us. Maya kept running her thumb over the raised numbers on the heavy black card. Her tears had stopped, completely replaced by a profound and overwhelming shock. I knew this was a lot for her to process. For her entire life, I had raised her with the values of hard work and humility. I never wanted the poison of extreme wealth to ruin her character the way it had ruined Preston's. I wanted her to build her own dreams and find her own passions, which she had done beautifully with her community art programs. But the world is a dangerous place for a kind heart. I had built my empire in the shadows, specifically so I could protect her when the wolves came knocking. And Preston Whitman was the worst kind of wolf. He was a coward, dressed in sheep clothing, who only felt tall when he was forcing someone else to their knees. He thought he had completely isolated her tonight. He thought that by humiliating her in front of his parents and stripping away her financial access, he would break her spirit and force her to crawl back to him on his terms. He expected her to wake up tomorrow morning desperate and terrified, willing to accept whatever miserable settlement he offered just to survive. I squeezed the steering wheel, my knuckles turning slightly lighter in the dark car. Richard and Susan Whitman were just as guilty. The way they had spoken to my daughter, the casual cruelty in their voices, the blatant racism disguised as high society concern. They had enabled his monstrous behavior for his entire life. They raised a boy who believed the world was a toy designed solely for his amusement. Tomorrow, the real games would begin. Preston would undoubtedly hire the most aggressive divorce attorneys in Atlanta. He would try to lock Maya out of her studio. He would try to use the resources of Lumina Innovations to bury her under mountains of legal paperwork. What he did not know, what he could never possibly comprehend, was that every single dollar he planned to use against my daughter actually belonged to me. I was the phantom chairman of his board. I was the invisible hand that signed his paychecks. I owned the very ground he walked on. I looked over at Maya. She was sitting up straighter now. The fear in her eyes was slowly being replaced by a sharp, intelligent curiosity. She was beginning to realize that the rules of the game had just fundamentally changed. "We are going to need a good lawyer," she whispered, staring out the window at the passing streetlights. I chuckled softly, a sound that carried no humor, only a promise of absolute destruction. "We are not getting a good lawyer, baby girl," I told her. "We are getting a shark, and we are going to let Preston pay for it." The drive back to my modest house in the suburbs was peaceful. I knew the storm that was coming tomorrow, but for tonight, I just wanted my daughter to feel safe. I wanted her to know that no man, no matter how arrogant or wealthy, could ever diminish her worth. She was a Sterling, and the Sterling women never lose. Later that afternoon, my daughter Maya decided she needed a moment away from the house to process everything that had happened. She drove her car to a high-end restaurant located in the upscale Buckhead district of Atlanta. She had originally planned to meet an old friend for a late lunch, but her friend had been forced to cancel at the very last minute. Maya decided to stay at the restaurant anyway because she desperately needed a quiet place to clear her head. She sat alone at a small corner table near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the busy city streets. She ordered a simple garden salad and a glass of expensive red wine, paying for it up front with the heavy black card I had given her the night before. She was just beginning to feel a small sense of peace when the nightmare walked right through the heavy glass doors of the restaurant. Chloe, the 28-year-old vice president of marketing, and the woman who had helped destroy my daughter's marriage, strode into the dining room like she owned the entire building. She was wearing a blindingly white designer dress that clung tightly to her thin frame. She looked every bit the arrogant corporate climber that she truly was. Maya saw her immediately, and her stomach instantly dropped, but she remembered my words from the morning. She remembered that she was a sterling, and that true power never panics. Maya kept her eyes focused forward, refusing to shrink away or look intimidated. Chloe spotted Maya sitting alone in the corner. Instead of feeling any shame or turning around to leave the restaurant, Chloe smiled a wicked, triumphant smile. She walked purposefully across the crowded dining room, the heels of her expensive shoes clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. She did not ask for permission to sit down at the table. She simply pulled out the chair across from my daughter and crossed her long legs, looking at Maya with an expression of pure mocking pity. "Hello, Maya," Chloe said, her voice sounding sweet, but laced with a heavy dose of absolute poison. "I saw your car parked outside and figured I would come inside and keep you company. You look completely exhausted today. It must be so incredibly hard losing the only good thing that ever happened to your sad little life." Maya took a slow, deep breath. She looked across the table at Chloe, trying her best to maintain her composure. It was right then that Maya noticed exactly what was resting against Chloe's collarbone. My daughter felt a sharp physical ache in her chest. Chloe was wearing a delicate vintage diamond necklace. It was not just any random piece of jewelry. It was the special anniversary gift Preston had given Maya exactly 1 year ago. Maya had noticed the necklace missing from her jewelry box a few weeks prior, but Preston had convinced her she must have carelessly misplaced it at the community art center. Seeing it now sparkling brightly on the neck of her husband's mistress was a calculated and cruel insult designed to break her spirit. "That necklace belongs to me," Maya said quietly, her eyes locked firmly on the sparkling diamonds. "You are sitting here wearing my stolen jewelry." Chloe laughed softly and reached her hand up to touch the necklace, twisting the expensive chain between her fingers. "Oh, this old thing," she mocked with a terrible grin. "Preston gave this to me last week. He said it looked completely wasted on a woman who spends her days playing with finger paints at a pathetic charity center. He wanted to see it on a woman who actually understands his high level of corporate ambition." "You really should be much more careful with your expensive things, Maya. Once you lose something valuable in this city, someone else will happily pick it up and wear it better than you ever did." Maya did not scream or raise her voice. She did not let a single tear fall from her eyes. She remembered the fire I had carefully cultivated inside her that morning in my garden. She simply folded her hands gently on the table and waited patiently for Chloe to reveal the real reason she had ambushed her at the restaurant. "You did not come over to my table just to talk about jewelry, Chloe," Maya said, her voice remarkably steady and calm. "What exactly do you want from me today?" Chloe dropped the fake sweet act immediately. Her face hardened, and she opened her expensive leather handbag. She pulled out a thick manila envelope and tossed it onto the center of the table, right next to Maya's glass of red wine. "Preston asked me to drop this off to you personally," Chloe stated coldly. "It is his final settlement offer. He is being incredibly generous considering the circumstances of your current financial situation. He is offering you a lump sum of $50,000 to sign the divorce papers today and walk away quietly without making a scene." Maya stared down at the brown envelope. $50,000, she repeated in disbelief. She had spent 5 long years supporting that man emotionally and financially. She had sacrificed her own personal savings to help him pay for his advanced business degrees before he became a wealthy executive. He was currently sitting on a massive mountain of company stock options and millions of dollars in performance bonuses, and he was offering her the equivalent of a cheap used car to disappear from his life forever. "It is a lot more money than you actually deserve," Chloe sneered, leaning aggressively across the small table. "You need to face the facts, Maya. You are an absolute nobody. You have no money, no power, and no influence in this city. Preston is a titan in the corporate world. His parents are basically Atlanta royalty. If you try to fight him in court, you will lose absolutely everything. You will end up owing him money for his massive legal fees. Take the $50,000 right now. Go rent a little rundown apartment somewhere in the South Side where you truly belong and consider yourself lucky that he is giving you anything at all." Maya slowly picked up her glass of red wine and took a measured sip. She swallowed the wine and set the crystal glass back down on the table. "I am not signing anything," she said calmly. "And I am certainly not taking a $50,000 insult from a woman who steals another woman's husband and wears her stolen jewelry to a lunch meeting. You can take that envelope back to Preston and tell him that I will happily see him in court." Chloe's eyes narrowed sharply. The smug confidence slipped from her face for just a second, replaced by a vicious and ugly anger. "You really do not understand how this game is played, do you?" she hissed, leaning even closer to Maya. "You think you can play the brave victim today. You think you can go after his alimony and his corporate assets? Preston is 10 steps ahead of you, Maya. If you do not sign those papers right now, we are going to destroy your entire life." Maya looked directly at her, challenging the ridiculous threat. "How exactly are you going to do that?" she asked without blinking. Chloe smiled a cold and deeply calculated smile. She leaned in so close that no one else in the busy restaurant could possibly hear her words. "We have emails, Maya," she whispered darkly. "Dozens and dozens of them. Emails sent directly from your Community Arts Center account showing that you have been actively embezzling charity funds to pay for your own personal expenses. We also have emails showing you having an illicit affair with one of your local vendors." Maya frowned slightly. "That is a complete lie," she said, defending herself. "I have never taken a single penny from the center, and I have never been unfaithful to my husband. You are making all of this up." "Of course it is a lie." Chloe laughed, her voice completely devoid of any human empathy. "But in high society, the actual truth does not matter at all, Maya. The only thing that matters is who has the power to control the public narrative. Preston has the absolute best digital forensics team in the state working for his company. They can fabricate any digital trail they want to make you look incredibly guilty. If you fight this divorce, we will leak those fake emails to every major news outlet and society blog in Atlanta. We will completely ruin your precious reputation. Your art center will lose all of its funding overnight. The city will shut your building down. The parents will pull all their children out of your programs. You will be a total pariah." Chloe leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms victoriously over her chest. "So you have a very simple choice to make right now, Maya. You can sign those papers, take the $50,000 and walk away with a tiny shred of your dignity intact, or you can fight us and we will bury you so deep you will never be able to show your face in this city again." Maya sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to fade completely into the background. She was looking at a woman who represented everything wrong with the corporate world. A woman who honestly believed that money could buy morality and that power gave her the right to destroy innocent lives without a single second thought. For a brief moment, Maya felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. She felt the urge to cry, to run away, and to hide from the overwhelming cruelty. But then she felt the heavy weight of the black metal card sitting inside her purse. She remembered the cold, absolute certainty in my voice when I told her that she owned the bank. She realized in that exact moment that Chloe and Preston were playing a simple game of checkers while my daughter and I were playing Grandmaster chess. They were threatening her with fake emails while I secretly held the actual financial keys to their entire existence. Maya did not flinch. She did not show a single ounce of fear. The transformation I had started in her that morning was now complete. She looked at Chloe not with anger, but with a profound and heavy pity. "You and Preston deserve each other," Maya said softly. "You are both completely empty inside." Chloe scoffed, rolling her eyes toward the ceiling. "Spare me the moral superiority, Maya. Are you going to sign the papers or not?" Maya slowly reached her right hand across the table. She did not reach for the manila envelope containing the settlement. Instead, her fingers wrapped gently around the delicate stem of her crystal wine glass. It was still filled near the brim with a rich, dark crimson Cabernet. Maya looked Chloe right in her eyes, holding her gaze with a terrifying level of intensity. She slowly picked up the glass. "What are you doing?" Chloe asked, her voice suddenly faltering as she noticed the dangerous and unpredictable shift in Maya's calm demeanor. Without breaking eye contact, Maya moved her hand directly over Chloe's lap. Then, with a smooth and highly deliberate flick of her wrist, Maya tipped the glass forward. The dark red wine poured out in a heavy splash, soaking directly into the front of Chloe's pristine white designer dress. The crimson stain spread instantly, ruining the expensive fabric completely and forever. Chloe shrieked at the top of her lungs. It was a loud, piercing sound that caused half the restaurant to turn around and stare in shock. She jumped out of her chair, knocking it backward onto the marble floor with a loud crash. She desperately clawed at the front of her ruined dress, her face turning a bright, blotchy red from pure humiliation and sudden shock. "Are you completely crazy?" Chloe screamed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at Maya. "Look what you just did! This dress costs more than you make in a month, you absolute psycho!" Maya calmly stood up from the table. She picked up her purse and slung it gracefully over her shoulder. She walked around the table, stepping carefully past the spilled drops of wine and the overturned chair. She stopped right next to the furious, dripping mistress who was still trying to wipe away the massive red stain. Maya leaned in very close to Chloe's ear. She did not yell to match Chloe's volume. She spoke in a low, calm whisper that sent a visible shiver down Chloe's spine. "Enjoy the rental," Maya whispered, her voice incredibly smooth and cold. "The lease is up." Maya turned and walked toward the exit of the restaurant, her head held high and her posture perfect. She did not look back even once. Chloe stood trembling in the middle of the upscale dining room, covered in dark red wine, while wealthy patrons continuously whispered and stared at her. "I am going to completely destroy you," she screamed. "After my daughter," her voice cracking with hysterical and pathetic rage. "Preston is going to take everything you have. You are dead, Maya. Do you hear me? You are completely dead." Maya simply pushed through the heavy glass doors and walked out into the warm Atlanta afternoon, leaving the chaos and the pathetic threats entirely behind her. When she called me a few minutes later to tell me exactly what had happened, I could not help but smile a very proud smile. My daughter had finally learned how to fight back against the monsters. Now it was my turn to show them what a real financial war actually looked like. The following morning found me back in my garden, where I always felt the most at peace. I was kneeling in the soft, dark dirt, wearing my faded denim overalls and a wide-brimmed straw hat. The sun was just beginning to warm the suburban streets. My neighborhood was quiet and unpretentious, filled with working-class families and retired school teachers. It was exactly the kind of place that made people like Richard Whitman incredibly uncomfortable. I heard the low purr of a massive engine long before the vehicle turned the corner. A silver Bentley slowly rolled down my narrow street, looking like an alien spaceship that had taken a wrong turn. It parked directly in front of my small wooden mailbox. The heavy door swung open, and Richard Whitman stepped out onto the cracked sidewalk. He was wearing a custom-tailored navy blue suit that probably cost more than my neighbor's entire car. He paused for a moment, looking at my modest single-story house with an expression of profound disgust. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and began walking up my concrete driveway, his leather shoes clicking sharply against the pavement. I did not stand up to greet him. I simply stayed on my knees, carefully packing the soil around a newly planted row of hydrangeas. I knew exactly why he was here. He was here to do the dirty work for his cowardly son. Preston had failed to intimidate Maya the day before with his corporate lawyers and his empty threats, so he had sent his wealthy father to try and buy our silence. Richard stopped at the edge of my garden, casting a long, dark shadow over my flowers. He did not say good morning. He simply stood there, expecting me to drop everything and immediately grovel for his attention. When I finally looked up at him, he offered a tight, condescending smile. "Good morning, Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying the same dripping arrogance his son had displayed the night of the anniversary party. I slowly stood up, brushing the dark soil from the knees of my overalls. I did not offer him my hand, and I certainly did not invite him inside my home. "Hello, Richard," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly flat. "To what do I owe the absolute displeasure of this uninvited visit?" He chuckled, a low, arrogant sound that grated against my nerves. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored jacket and pulled out a crisp white envelope. "Let us not waste each other's time playing games, Evelyn," he said, looking around my small yard as if the very air was somehow beneath him. "We both know that things have become quite messy between our children. Preston is extremely busy running a major company, and he simply does not have the time or the energy to deal with a long, drawn-out public divorce. He is a very important man in this city, and he needs this unfortunate situation handled quickly and quietly." I crossed my arms over my chest and stared at him, waiting for him to reveal the trap. "And how exactly does he propose to handle it?" I asked softly. Richard tapped the crisp white envelope against the palm of his hand. "Inside this envelope is a certified bank check made out directly to you, Evelyn. It is a very generous offer from my family to yours. We are willing to give you exactly $100,000 right now today. In exchange, you are going to sit your daughter down and make her see reason. You are going to convince Maya to sign the divorce papers without contesting a single clause." She walks away quietly. She makes no claims to the bank accounts, the investments, or the community art center. She also surrenders full ownership of the Atlanta mansion and gives Preston complete physical custody of the golden retriever. I stared at him, letting the sheer audacity of his words sink in. He wanted my daughter to walk away from 5 years of marriage with absolutely nothing, while his son kept every single asset they had built together. He even wanted to take her dog just to inflict maximum emotional pain. It was not a negotiation, it was a complete and total erasure of my daughter's existence. "You want to buy my daughter out of her own life for $100,000, I stated, keeping my voice completely devoid of any emotion. Richard sighed heavily, as if he was speaking to a particularly slow and stubborn child. "Do not be dramatic, Evelyn," he sneered. "Let us be realistic about where you come from. My family comes from a long line of generational wealth. We understand how the world operates. You people always want a handout. You see a successful family like mine, and you think you can just attach yourselves and drain our resources forever." He took a step closer, invading my personal space. The smell of his expensive cologne was overpowering and deeply offensive. "Take the check, Evelyn," he commanded, his voice dropping into a harsh, completely disrespectful tone. $100,000 is a fortune to someone like you. It is more money than you have seen in your entire life. You can finally pay off this sad little house. You can buy yourself a nicer garden. You can stop pretending that you and Maya belong in our social circles and go back to living a quiet, simple life on the South Side where you both truly belong. Do not make the mistake of thinking you can fight us in court. If you decline this money today, Preston will tie Maya up in so much litigation that she will end up owing us money. Take the money and walk away." He held the white envelope out toward me, his gray eyes practically glowing with a sickening sense of racist superiority. He fully believed he had won. He believed he was throwing scraps to a starving dog and that I should be bowing down in profound gratitude for his incredible mercy. I looked at the envelope. I looked at his arrogant face. A lesser woman would have slapped him across his jaw. A lesser woman would have screamed at him to get off her property and threatened to call the police. But I was not a lesser woman. I was a grandmaster chess player looking at a pawn who had just willingly stepped onto a fatal square. I knew exactly what I needed to do to destroy his entire legacy. I lowered my eyes, staring at the ground, and I let my shoulders slump forward, simulating the posture of a completely defeated and broken older woman. I slowly reached out my hand. My fingers brushed against the crisp white paper. I took the envelope from his grasp, pretending that the decision was tearing me apart inside. "Very well, Richard," I whispered, my voice deliberately shaking just enough to sell the performance. "I will talk to Maya. I will make sure she signs the divorce papers exactly as Preston wants them." Richard threw his head back and laughed loudly. It was a terrible booming sound that echoed across my quiet suburban street. He was completely thrilled by his perceived victory over the poor black mother. "I knew you would finally see reason, Evelyn." He chuckled, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "It is always so predictable with people like you. At the end of the day, you always take the cash. Enjoy your new garden." He turned his back and walked away. He climbed back into his silver Bentley, the engine roaring to life. I stood motionless in the dirt, watching as the luxury vehicle sped away, turning the corner and disappearing from my sight forever. The moment the car was completely gone, my shaking hands stopped. My defeated posture vanished instantly, and my spine straightened like a steel rod. I did not open the envelope. I turned around and walked up the short steps into my modest kitchen. Sitting quietly at my wooden dining table was a tall man wearing a sharp gray suit. He was the elite private investigator I retained for all corporate intelligence matters at Sterling Vanguard. He had arrived an hour earlier and had heard every single word through the open kitchen window. He looked up from his tablet, his expression entirely neutral. "Did he give you the check?" my investigator asked. I walked over to the table and dropped the white envelope onto the wooden surface. I smiled a cold, calculating smile that would have made Richard Whitman drop dead from pure terror. "He did," I replied calmly. "Take the check directly to our forensic accountants. I want you to trace that routing number immediately. Find out exactly how highly leveraged the Whitmans are across all their businesses and personal estates. Buy their mortgages, do it. Find out exactly how leveraged the Whitmans are. I want to buy Richard's debt." The next morning, a heavy knock on my door shattered the peace of my home. I opened it to find a courier standing on my porch holding a stack of legal documents. He asked for Maya and handed over the heavy manila envelope before walking away. Maya came downstairs wrapped in a blanket holding a cup of coffee. When she saw the envelope in my hands, all the color drained from her beautiful face. We sat down at the kitchen table and she tore open the seal. As she read the first page, her hands began to shake violently. A gasp escaped her lips, and then an agonizing sob tore out of her chest. I rushed to her side, pulling the papers from her trembling fingers to read them myself. Preston had sunk to a level of cruelty that even I had not anticipated. He was not just coming after her money anymore. He was coming after her future children. During their 5-year marriage, Maya and Preston had struggled deeply with fertility. It was a painful journey that brought my daughter many tears. They had eventually gone through extensive treatments and successfully frozen 6 embryos at a high-end fertility clinic in Atlanta. Those embryos represented Maya's deepest dream of becoming a mother. Now, Preston was filing an emergency legal injunction to seize exclusive custody of all 6 frozen embryos. In the filing, he coldly stated that he intended to have them destroyed. He claimed that because he paid for the medical procedures with his corporate salary, they were his personal property to dispose of as he saw fit. He wanted to erase any biological trace of their marriage, and he knew this specific threat would strike a fatal blow directly to Maya's heart. I held my weeping daughter in my arms, feeling a hot rage burning through my veins, but the cruelty did not stop there. I continued reading through the legal filings, and my anger quickly turned into a calculated focus. Preston and his corporate lawyers had manufactured an alternate reality. The motion was packed with completely fabricated affidavits, committing outright perjury on an astonishing scale. Chloe, the mistress who had stolen my daughter's necklace, had submitted a formal sworn statement claiming that Maya had violently ambushed her at the restaurant. Chloe completely lied and told the court that Maya had screamed psychotic threats and physically assaulted her without any provocation whatsoever. Other senior executives from Lumina Innovations had also signed fraudulent affidavits. These were wealthy men who had smiled in my daughter's face at dinner parties. Now they were falsely swearing under oath that Maya had a long documented history of mental instability. They claimed she had repeatedly harassed corporate staff, sent unhinged emails to investors, and severely disrupted operations. They painted a false picture of a deranged woman who was completely unfit to manage her own finances, let alone have custody of future children. Preston was using his entire corporate hierarchy to build a wall of lies so thick that no judge would question it. He was leveraging the credibility of a billion-dollar technology firm to assassinate the character of an art teacher. Maya rested her head on the table, her tears soaking into the sleeves of her sweater. "Mom, I cannot fight this," she cried, her voice breaking with despair. "Look at all these signatures. These are powerful executives. They have endless resources. They are all lying under oath just to protect him, and the court is going to believe them. He is going to take my baby's mom. He is going to destroy them just to punish me for standing up to him. I am so tired. Maybe I should just give up and sign whatever he wants, so he will leave my embryos alone." I placed my hand firmly on the back of her head, stroking her hair until her breathing began to slow down. I let her cry until there were no tears left in her body. Then I pulled my chair back and stood up, towering over the kitchen table. I looked down at the fabricated legal documents, and then I looked directly into my daughter's swollen red eyes. "Maya Sterling," I said, my voice carrying a deep, resonant authority that commanded her full attention. "You listen to me very carefully right now. You are crying over the actions of a weak coward. A real man does not need to manufacture lies to win a battle. A real man does not hold unborn children hostage just to force a woman into submission. Preston is doing all of this because he is absolutely terrified of you. He knows that he has no real power without his money and his fake corporate friends." Maya sat up slowly, wiping her face with the back of her hand. "But Mom, they have an army of corporate lawyers," she whispered. "They have the company backing him up." I smiled a very slow and dangerous smile. "Let them have their little army baby girl," I told her. "Let them commit all the perjury they want. Every single lie they put on that paper is just another nail in their own coffin. You have spent the last 2 days playing defense. You have been reacting to his every move, letting him dictate the terms of this fight. That ends right here and right now. We are no longer playing his pathetic little game. We are going to flip the entire board upside down." I walked over to the kitchen counter and picked up my cell phone. "Go upstairs and wash your face," I commanded her gently but firmly. "Put on your absolute best power suit. Do not wear the clothes he bought you. Wear the suit you bought for yourself when you opened the art center. We are leaving this house in exactly 30 minutes. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice finally showing a tiny spark of life. "We are going to go meet your new best friend," I replied. 45 minutes later, we were walking into the towering glass and steel skyscraper located in the absolute wealthiest financial sector of downtown Atlanta. Maya looked around in quiet confusion as the private elevator carried us up to the top floor. We stepped out into a breathtaking reception area adorned with imported Italian marble and original modern art. This was not a standard family law practice. This was the most elite and terrifying corporate litigation firm in the entire state. These were the lawyers who represented billionaires, multinational conglomerates, and foreign royalty. They did not handle simple divorces unless billions of dollars were on the line. The receptionist immediately recognized me and escorted us into a massive corner office with panoramic views of the entire city. Sitting behind a sleek mahogany desk was a woman who radiated absolute terrifying power. She wore a perfectly tailored crimson suit, and her sharp, dark eyes evaluated every single movement we made. This was Jacqueline. She was widely known in the legal world as the corporate executioner. She had destroyed massive tech monopolies and bankrupted corrupt billionaires without breaking a single sweat. Jacqueline stood up and extended her hand toward my daughter. Maya was completely speechless, realizing exactly who was standing in front of her. "Good morning, Maya," Jacqueline said, her voice smooth and deadly. "Your mother has told me everything about your current situation. I have already reviewed the ridiculous legal filings your husband submitted this morning." Maya shook her hand nervously. "You are taking my case?" Maya asked in disbelief. But you only represent giant corporations. How can we possibly afford you?" Jacqueline looked over at me and offered a rare, genuine smile. "Evelyn and I go way back," she told Maya. "Your mother is a very special client of mine. When she called me this morning and told me what this arrogant little boy was trying to do to your future children, I cleared my entire schedule for the next 3 months." Jacqueline walked around her desk and picked up the stack of perjured affidavits from the Lumina executives. "Preston and his friends have made a catastrophic mistake," Maya Jacqueline said, tossing the papers onto her desk with disgust. "They committed federal perjury using company resources. They think they are fighting a helpless housewife. They do not know they just walked into a slaughterhouse. We are not just going to win this case, Maya. We are going to obliterate his entire existence. We are going to take his money, his job, his reputation, and his freedom. Are you ready to go to war?" Maya looked at Jacqueline, and then she looked back at me. I gave her a small, proud nod. Maya turned back to the ruthless attorney and stood up perfectly straight. All the fear and sadness had completely vanished from her beautiful eyes. She was a true sterling through and through. "I am absolutely ready to win this war," Maya said. The atmosphere inside the massive glass and steel headquarters of Lumina Innovations was electric, with a toxic kind of energy. Preston sat behind his massive mahogany desk, feeling like an absolute king who had just conquered a new territory. He had just filed the fraudulent legal documents against Maya, and he genuinely believed he had won the war. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. He felt completely untouchable. In his mind, he was a corporate genius who had successfully outsmarted his wife and her poor mother. He honestly thought that the anonymous board of directors who owned his company were just a group of lazy investors who only cared about their quarterly dividends. He had absolutely no idea that every single move he made was being carefully monitored by the very woman he was actively trying to destroy. Chloe, the mistress, was lounging on the sleek modern sofa in the corner of his corner office. She was sipping champagne from a crystal flute, acting as if she had already been crowned the new queen of his fabricated empire. She had spent the entire morning complaining about the small size of her current luxury apartment. She whined that a woman of her new elevated status required a residence that truly reflected her importance within the company. Preston, being completely blinded by his own inflated ego and his desperate need to impress her, decided it was time to make a grand gesture. He wanted to prove to Chloe and to himself that he possessed unlimited power. He was no longer satisfied with just receiving his massive salary and his generous performance bonuses. He wanted more. He felt entitled to take whatever he wanted from the company accounts simply because he was the chief executive officer. This was the exact psychological trap I had been waiting for him to fall into. Absolute power always reveals the true nature of a corrupt man. Preston turned his attention back to his dual computer monitors. He logged directly into the highest-level corporate financial portal using his secure executive credentials. He navigated past the standard operating budgets and went straight into the massive reserve funds of the company. These were restricted accounts meant only for major corporate acquisitions and absolute emergencies. Preston did not care about corporate governance or federal regulations. He pulled up the listing online. He found a breathtaking multi-million-dollar penthouse located in the most exclusive high-rise building in downtown Atlanta. It featured panoramic views, a private rooftop pool, and a private elevator. It was completely absurd and wildly expensive. Preston smiled a wicked, arrogant smile and initiated a direct wire transfer for the entire purchase price of the luxury penthouse. He routed the millions of dollars directly from the Lumina Innovations Restricted Corporate Reserve Fund into a private real estate holding account under Chloe's name. When the system prompted him to provide a legal justification for the massive withdrawal, he did not even hesitate. He typed in the words "executive retention bonus" and hit the submit button. He actually believed he was clever. He thought that by wrapping his blatant theft in standard corporate jargon, he could easily hide his crimes from the internal auditors. He was so drunk on his own perceived invincibility that he failed to realize he was leaving a massive digital trail of undeniable federal fraud. He poured himself a glass of champagne and walked over to Chloe, handing her the drink and proudly announcing that he had just bought her a penthouse. They laughed together, mocking Maya and celebrating their stolen wealth. But their celebration was destined to be incredibly short-lived. The financial systems at Lumina Innovations were highly advanced. Every single transaction over a certain dollar amount automatically triggered a direct security review. Less than 20 minutes after Preston initiated the fraudulent wire transfer, the heavy glass door to his office swung open. The chief financial officer of Lumina Innovations walked in looking absolutely furious. His name was David, and he was a meticulous veteran of the financial industry who took his fiduciary responsibilities very seriously. David held a printed copy of the transaction log in his trembling hand. He did not bother to knock or wait for an invitation to speak. He marched directly up to Preston's desk and slammed the piece of paper down on the polished wood. "What in the world do you think you are doing, Preston?" he demanded, his voice echoing loudly across the large office. "You just attempted to wire millions of dollars from the restricted corporate reserve fund to purchase a residential penthouse for your vice president of marketing. This is a blatant violation of our corporate charter, and it is a massive federal crime. You cannot just steal company money and label it an executive retention bonus. I am stopping this wire transfer immediately, and I am reporting this to the board of directors." Preston lost his arrogant smile instantly. His face turned a deep shade of angry red. He slammed his champagne glass down on his desk and stood up, towering over the older financial officer. "You work for me, David," he screamed, spit flying from his lips. "I am the chief executive officer of this company. I built this place from the ground up. I generate the revenue and I make the financial decisions. You are just a glorified accountant. You do not have the authority to question my executive compensation packages. Do not you ever walk into my office and threaten me again." David stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated by the screaming tyrant. "You did not build this company." "Preston." David fired back calmly but firmly. "The holding company owns this business and you are just an employee. If this wire transfer goes through, the federal authorities will audit this entire building. I will not let you drag my professional reputation down with your pathetic personal greed. Cancel the transfer right now or I will lock you out of the financial system myself." Preston completely lost his mind. His ego could not handle being challenged in front of Chloe. He pointed a shaking finger directly at the chief financial officer. "You are fired," David Preston bellowed at the top of his lungs. "You are fired right this second for gross insubordination. Pack up your desk and get out of my building before I have security throw you out on the street. You are officially done in this industry." David looked at Preston with a mixture of profound pity and absolute disgust. He slowly picked up the printed transaction log from the desk. "You are making a catastrophic mistake," Preston David said quietly. "You have absolutely no idea what you are doing." David turned around and walked out of the office, leaving Preston breathing heavily and trying to act like a tough guy for his mistress. Preston immediately logged back into the system, officially terminating David's employment and pushing the massive wire transfer through by overriding the security protocols. He thought he had just eliminated his only obstacle. He was completely wrong. Later that evening, the sun was setting over the city, casting long, dark shadows across the streets. I was sitting alone in a quiet, unpretentious diner located on the outskirts of Atlanta. It was a simple place with vinyl booths and neon signs, completely far away from the luxurious world Preston and his parents inhabited. I wore my simple floral dress and sipped a cup of black coffee, blending in perfectly with the tired workers and late-night travelers. The bell above the front door chimed softly. David, the recently fired chief financial officer, walked into the diner. He looked around the room, spotting me sitting alone in the back corner booth. He walked over and slid into the vinyl seat across from me. He looked exhausted, but there was a sharp spark of deep satisfaction in his eyes. I did not say a word at first. I simply reached down onto the floor next to my feet and lifted a heavy leather briefcase. I placed the briefcase onto the sticky diner table and slid it slowly across the surface until it rested directly in front of David. "You did exactly what I asked you to do, David. I said, my voice low and completely calm. "You played your part perfectly. You pushed his ego to the absolute breaking point, and you forced him to override the security protocols himself. Here is your severance package. Now hand over the flash drive." David rested his hand on the leather briefcase. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver drive. He placed it on the table. "He took the bait," Evelyn David said. "He bypassed all internal controls. Everything is on that drive. You have handed the authorities a perfect prosecution." I picked up the drive. Tomorrow the shadow chairwoman steps into the light, and everything changes forever now. The following Monday morning, Preston arrived at the Lumina Innovations headquarters, feeling like a conquering emperor returning from a glorious battle. He had successfully forced out his chief financial officer and executed his fraudulent wire transfer without facing any immediate consequences from the Corporate Oversight Committee. His ego was so incredibly inflated that he honestly believed he had completely outsmarted the entire federal financial system. He called an emergency all-hands meeting in the massive glass atrium of the towering corporate building. Hundreds of dedicated employees gathered around the main floor, murmuring in quiet confusion about the sudden disruption to their workday. Preston stood alone on the grand marble staircase, looking down at the hard-working people he secretly considered to be his absolute inferiors. He held a silver microphone in his hand and smiled a sickeningly bright, triumphant smile. He proudly announced that Lumina Innovations was officially preparing for an initial public offering in the very near future. He told the cheering crowd that taking the company public would elevate them all to new heights of success. But in his selfish mind, he only cared about the billions of dollars he personally planned to secure for himself. He desperately wanted to be recognized globally as an untouchable tech titan. Immediately after the sweeping staff meeting concluded, he marched directly back into his sprawling corner office and ordered his corporate legal team to draft a formal request for an emergency board meeting. He wanted the anonymous holding company to authorize the immediate issuance of 10 million new shares of stock directly into his own personal portfolio before the public offering went live on the global market. He was so entirely blinded by his own massive greed that he never stopped to wonder why the mysterious board of directors had remained silent. To completely solidify his newly imagined status as a future billionaire, Preston demanded that his corporate public relations team immediately book him a live interview on the most prestigious national business news network in the country. He desperately wanted to look directly into the camera and show the entire viewing audience how incredibly successful, wealthy, and untouchable he truly was. The television network eagerly agreed to the sudden interview request, hoping to get an exclusive scoop on the highly anticipated upcoming public offering. On the morning of the live national broadcast, Preston stood confidently inside the luxurious green room of the television studio in downtown Atlanta. He wore a brand-new bespoke tailored suit that easily cost more than most working families earned in an entire year. Chloe, the mistress who had helped destroy my daughter's marriage, stood right beside him, fixing his expensive silk tie and whispering empty praises of adoration into his ear. She was still secretly bitter about her ruined white designer dress from the restaurant incident, but the intoxicating promise of endless wealth kept her firmly attached to his side. Preston looked at his own reflection in the brightly lit vanity mirror and saw a self-made genius staring back at him. He truly believed with all his heart that he had built his entire magnificent life using nothing but his own sheer brilliance and relentless hard work. He completely erased the painful memory of my daughter Maya working incredibly late nights to pay for his expensive business school tuition. He conveniently forgot about the countless times she had willingly compromised her own beautiful dreams just so he could selfishly chase his wild corporate ambitions. In his completely distorted mind, Maya was just useless dead weight that he had finally and completely discarded away forever now. He confidently walked out onto the brightly lit television set and warmly shook hands with the famous veteran financial anchor. The heavy studio cameras rolled into their final positions, and the bright red recording light illuminated, indicating that they were now broadcasting live to millions of eager viewers across the entire country. Back at my own modest suburban house, I was sitting incredibly comfortably on my simple floral living room sofa, holding a warm, comforting cup of sweet herbal tea. Maya sat right beside me, her posture perfectly straight, and her beautiful dark eyes completely focused on the large flat-screen television mounted securely on the wall. Jacqueline, our newly hired and completely ruthless corporate attorney, sat calmly in the vintage armchair directly across from us, typing rapidly on her highly encrypted laptop computer. We watched closely as Preston's arrogant face completely filled the television screen. The seasoned anchor started the prestigious interview by generously praising Preston's rapid and unprecedented rise in the highly competitive technology sector. Preston soaked up the glowing praise like a desperately dry sponge in the vast desert. He leaned forward in his chair, acting like a profoundly wise philosopher of modern business strategy. When the anchor politely asked him about his ultimate secret to achieving such incredible financial success, Preston simply could not resist the terrible urge to take a cruel and highly public jab at my beloved daughter. He looked directly into the studio camera with a cold, empty, and deeply condescending smile. The true secret to ultimate corporate success is knowing exactly when to cut out the dead weight. Preston said, his voice dripping with false authority and overwhelming arrogance. You have to be completely willing to eliminate all personal distractions from your life forever today easily, without any true hesitation or regret. For a very long time, I foolishly let certain weak people hold me back because they simply did not possess the intellectual capacity to truly understand my massive global vision. Once I finally removed those small-minded negative distractions, my company immediately exploded into a highly profitable multi-billion-dollar enterprise. I am a completely self-made man, and I absolutely refuse to ever apologize for leaving weak and unmotivated people behind me. Maya gripped her warm teacup very tightly, but she did not shed a single tear of sadness. She just looked at his televised face with a feeling of profound and heavy pity. He was sitting on national television, loudly bragging about being a brilliant self-made man while actively embezzling millions of dollars from the very company I secretly owned. He was nothing but a complete pathetic fraud, wearing a ridiculously expensive costume. I gently set my ceramic teacup down on the polished wooden coffee table and carefully picked up my highly encrypted digital tablet. I looked directly over at Jacqueline, who immediately gave me a sharp and completely confirming nod of approval. The elaborate financial traps we had so carefully set over the past few difficult days were now fully primed and entirely ready to be sprung upon our unsuspecting enemies. I slowly tapped the glowing screen and officially authorized Sterling Vanguard to instantly execute the massive debt acquisition program my elite private investigator had meticulously prepared. Within mere seconds, billions of dollars quietly shifted across the complex global financial markets. On the large television screen, the live interview was continuing very smoothly without any apparent issues. Preston was happily rambling on about his brilliant visionary leadership and his grand architectural plans to build a completely massive new corporate headquarters very soon directly downtown. Suddenly, the seasoned television anchor paused right in the middle of a long sentence. He quickly reached his hand up to press against his hidden earpiece, listening very intently to the frantic instructions coming from his producers in the hidden control room. The anchor's professional face shifted instantly from a look of polite interest to an expression of absolute genuine shock. He looked down at the glowing digital monitor embedded directly into his news desk, and then he looked back up at Preston with wide eyes. Preston stopped talking completely, clearly confused by the sudden awkward interruption to his glorious moment. "I am incredibly sorry to interrupt you, Preston," the veteran anchor said, his professional voice completely changing its tone to reflect the immense gravity of the situation. "We are getting some absolutely incredible breaking financial news coming across the global wire right this very second, and it concerns you and your family directly." Preston puffed out his chest proudly, fully assuming the breaking news was just a positive market reaction about his upcoming lucrative public offering. He smiled an incredibly smug and arrogant smile and proudly told the anchor to go ahead and share the wonderful good news with the entire watching world. The anchor looked directly into the camera lens and began to read the breaking financial alert loudly. According to our reliable sources, a private holding company known as Sterling Vanguard has just legally purchased all of your outstanding personal debts. They have bought the primary mortgage on your $10 million Buckhead mansion. Effectively, Preston, this anonymous company now entirely owns every single asset tied to your family name. The color instantly drained from Preston's face. His smug billionaire persona completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified little boy, completely and utterly ruined, on live television today. The afternoon sun was casting long, dark shadows across the living room of my modest suburban home. We had spent the entire morning watching the financial markets shift and observing the absolute panic rippling through the various accounts tied to the Whitman family. My elite private investigator had successfully executed the massive debt acquisition program, and the trap was now completely set. It was finally time to deliver the absolute final blow to Preston's massive ego. I looked over at my beautiful daughter Maya, who was sitting quietly on the floral sofa, holding her cell phone tightly in her hands. She knew exactly what she needed to do today. We had meticulously rehearsed this specific moment for hours because we needed Preston to believe that he had completely won the war. I sat down next to her and gently placed my hand over hers. "You need to make him believe that you are entirely broken." "Baby girl," I told her softly. "You have to feed his endless narcissism. He desperately wants to feel like a powerful king who has successfully crushed a peasant rebellion. Let him have his fragile illusion for just one more day." Maya took a long, deep breath and nodded her head slowly. She closed her eyes and thought about all the horrible things he had done to her over the past 5 years. She thought about the slap in the bedroom, the cruel words from his terrible parents, and the disgusting attempt to steal her frozen embryos. When she finally opened her eyes, they were filled with genuine tears. But they were tears of absolute focused anger, disguised as profound sorrow. Maya unlocked her phone and dialed the number she had previously promised herself she would never call again. The phone rang 3 times before Preston finally answered. He did not say hello. He simply barked his own name into the receiver with a tone of overwhelming arrogance. Maya immediately let out a loud, heartbreaking sob that sounded incredibly real. "Preston," she cried, her voice shaking violently as if she was on the verge of a total mental collapse. "Please, you have to stop this. I cannot take this anymore." The sound of her crying acted like absolute magic on his inflated ego. I could hear his breathing slow down and deepen through the speakerphone. He was soaking up her manufactured pain like a dry sponge, soaking up fresh water. "Well, well, well," Preston sneered, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "Look who finally decided to come crawling back to reality. I told you this would happen, Maya. I told you that you were completely out of your depth trying to fight a man like me. Did you really think your pathetic little lawyers could stop the entire corporate legal department of Lumina Innovations?" Maya let out another dramatic sob, covering her face with her free hand, even though he could not see her. "You win, Preston," she wept loudly into the phone. "You win everything. I am completely exhausted, and I have absolutely no money left to fight you. Please just leave my community art center alone and tell your lawyers to drop the petition for the embryos. I will give you the house and the accounts and the dog." Preston laughed, a terrible, booming laugh that echoed through my quiet living room. He was completely drunk on his own perceived power. "It is a little too late for negotiations, Maya," he mocked cruelly. "I already told you that I'm going to take absolutely everything. But since you are begging so nicely, I might consider showing you a tiny shred of mercy. The annual Lumina Innovations corporate gala is tomorrow night. I want you to come to the gala in person. I want you to stand in front of my parents and my colleagues, and I want you to sign the final divorce papers right there in the main ballroom. If you do that quietly and respectfully, I will drop the petition for the embryos. If you do not show up, I will destroy them on Monday morning." Maya let out a small, pathetic whimper, perfectly playing the role of a completely defeated woman. "Okay, Preston," she whispered, her voice sounding incredibly small and broken. "I will be there tomorrow night. I will sign whatever you want me to sign. Just please promise me that you will leave me alone after this is over." Preston chuckled darkly. "Oh, I will gladly leave you alone, Maya," he promised. "You are nothing but a massive disappointment to me anyway. Make sure you wear something cheap so you do not embarrass me in front of my wealthy investors." He ended the call abruptly without another word, leaving the dial tone echoing loudly in the quiet suburban room. Maya slowly lowered the phone from her ear. Across the city, in his sprawling executive corner office, Preston tossed his phone onto his massive mahogany desk. He leaned back in his expensive leather chair and let out a loud, triumphant sigh. Chloe, the mistress, was sitting on the modern sofa across the room, scrolling through her phone while wearing a brand-new designer outfit bought with stolen corporate funds. "What was all that crying about?" Chloe asked, looking up with a deeply annoyed expression. Preston smiled a wicked and entirely arrogant smile. "That was my pathetic soon-to-be ex-wife," he bragged proudly. "She is completely broken. She called me begging for mercy. She agreed to come to the gala tomorrow night and sign all the papers giving me absolutely everything." Chloe rolled her eyes and took a sip of her expensive sparkling water. "Well, it is about time she realized her actual place in the world," Chloe sneered. "She really thought she could challenge us in court. She thought she was so tough spilling wine on my dress." Preston stood up and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling Atlanta skyline. He felt like an absolute god, standing above all the tiny, insignificant people below him. "They always try to act incredibly tough at first," Preston said, his voice laced with a disgusting combination of racism and extreme misogyny. "But black women always fold when you show them real corporate power. They talk a big game, but the second you cut off their money and threaten their little charity projects, they immediately drop to their knees and beg." Preston genuinely believed every single toxic word he was saying. He thought his wealth and his white male privilege made him completely invincible to any real consequences. He had spent his entire life being protected by his rich parents and his corporate titles. He did not know what it felt like to actually struggle or to build something from absolutely nothing. He simply took what he wanted and destroyed anyone who dared to stand in his way. Tomorrow night at the massive corporate gala, he planned to publicly humiliate Maya in front of the entire Atlanta high society. He wanted to parade her around as a defeated trophy, to prove to his wealthy parents and his board of directors that he was an absolutely ruthless and highly effective leader. Back in my quiet living room, the dial tone finally stopped buzzing. Maya set the phone down on the wooden coffee table. The moment the phone left her hands, her entire demeanor completely shifted. The fake tears that had been streaming down her cheeks instantly vanished. Her shoulders straightened and her spine turned back into solid steel. She looked up at me and a slow, dangerous smile spread across her beautiful face. "He bought every single word of it, Mom," Maya said, her voice entirely steady and completely devoid of any sadness. "He wants me to sign the papers tomorrow night at his precious corporate gala. He thinks he has completely destroyed us." I nodded proudly. "He is exactly as predictable as I thought he would be," I replied calmly. Arrogant men always mistake strategic silence for weakness. They are so busy looking down on everyone else that they never see the massive trap opening up right beneath their own feet. He thinks he is setting the stage for your ultimate humiliation, but he has actually just invited us to his own public execution. I stood up from the sofa and walked toward the hallway. "We have a lot of preparing to do, baby girl," I told her. "Tomorrow night, the shadow chairwoman is finally stepping out into the light, and we need to make sure we are dressed appropriately for a corporate funeral." The next evening arrived incredibly fast. The tension in the air was absolutely electric. The Lumina Innovations corporate gala was being held at the most exclusive luxury hotel in downtown Atlanta. Hundreds of wealthy investors, corporate executives, and local politicians were currently arriving in expensive black cars and walking the red carpet. Inside the grand ballroom, crystal chandeliers cast a bright glowing light over the lavish decorations and the endless tables of expensive champagne. Preston and Chloe were already there greeting guests and acting like absolute royalty. Meanwhile, back at my house, we were putting the final touches on our own grand entrance. Maya was in her old bedroom getting ready with the help of a professional styling team I had quietly hired for the evening. I was standing in front of the tall mirror in my own bedroom, carefully preparing myself for the most important night of my entire life. For 7 long years, I had intentionally dressed in cheap floral dresses and faded overalls. I had played the role of the poor, uneducated mother-in-law to absolute perfection. But tonight, I was finally putting on my true armor. I stepped into a stunning, custom-tailored Carolina Herrera gown. The fabric was a deep, rich navy blue that moved like liquid silk. It fit me perfectly, projecting an image of undeniable wealth and absolute terrifying authority. I reached into my velvet jewelry box and pulled out a heavy, sparkling diamond necklace that was worth more than Preston's entire yearly salary. I fastened the cold, heavy diamonds around my neck and looked at my own reflection. I did not look like a woman who baked pies for church anymore. I looked like the sole owner of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm. I looked like the woman who held the absolute power to destroy a corrupt tech executive with a single word. The bedroom door slowly creaked open. Maya walked into the room, and she looked absolutely breathtaking. She was not wearing the cheap, conservative clothes Preston always forced her to wear. She was draped in custom haute couture, looking exactly like the fierce, independent queen I always knew she was. Maya stopped in the doorway and looked at my stunning gown and the heavy, sparkling diamonds. She had never seen me dressed in my true corporate armor before. A fierce, confident fire burned brightly in her dark eyes. She knew that tonight was the night we were going to take back absolutely everything that had been stolen from her. She watched as I slowly reached up and secured the diamond earrings into place. Maya took a deep breath, feeling the massive weight of the upcoming battle settling onto her shoulders. "Are the feds in position, Mom?" Maya asked, her voice perfectly calm and completely ready for absolute war. I looked at her through the reflection in the mirror and gave a single firm nod. "They are waiting for my signal," I said. The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel in downtown Atlanta was entirely transformed into a blinding display of excessive corporate wealth for the annual Lumina Innovations Gala. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from the soaring painted ceilings, casting a warm golden light over hundreds of the most powerful people in the city. Waiters dressed in crisp white tuxedos glided silently across the polished marble floors, carrying silver trays completely loaded with vintage champagne and incredibly expensive caviar. In the absolute center of the massive room, an enormous ice sculpture of the Lumina Innovations corporate logo slowly melted under the bright television lights. Tonight was supposed to be the absolute crowning achievement of Preston Whitman and his completely fabricated corporate empire. He had spared absolutely no expense for this specific evening because he desperately wanted every single important investor in the city to view him as an untouchable technology titan. The air inside the grand ballroom was incredibly thick with the overwhelming smell of expensive designer perfumes and the loud, arrogant laughter of people who truly believed they owned the entire world. It was a perfectly crafted illusion of stability and massive success designed specifically to hide the rotting core of a man who was actively destroying everything he touched. Preston stood near the main stage holding a crystal glass of champagne and soaking up the endless praise from his wealthy board members. He was wearing a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo that cost more than most people earned in 2 entire years. Beside him stood Chloe the mistress, who had eagerly helped him destroy his own marriage. She was wearing a completely inappropriate skin-tight silver gown and a brand new diamond necklace purchased entirely with stolen corporate funds. Despite the terrifying breaking news from the television interview earlier that day, Preston had somehow managed to convince himself that he was still completely in control. His massive ego simply would not allow him to process the reality that an anonymous holding company had purchased his personal debts. He loudly told anyone who would listen that the news report was just a minor administrative error and that his lawyers were already fixing the tiny misunderstanding. He laughed loudly and continuously drank more champagne, desperate to maintain the fragile illusion of his ultimate supreme power. Chloe clung to his arm constantly, whispering empty compliments into his ear and completely ignoring the judgmental stares from some of the older conservative wives in the room. They both truly believed that tonight they were untouchable royalty, completely immune to any real consequences for their terrible actions. Preston kept glancing toward the heavy mahogany doors at the entrance of the ballroom. He was eagerly waiting for my daughter Maya to arrive. He was absolutely vibrating with cruel anticipation, hoping to see her walk through those massive doors wearing cheap clothes and crying tears of total defeat. He had already instructed his corporate photographers to be ready to capture the exact moment she signed the divorce papers in front of everyone so he could permanently memorialize her complete humiliation. Across the room, Richard and Susan Whitman were holding their own arrogant court among their wealthy country club friends. Susan wore a heavy emerald necklace and held her champagne glass with her pinky finger extended, looking down her nose at the entire world. She was loudly bragging to a group of influential socialites about how her brilliant son was finally shedding the dead weight from his life. "It is honestly such a massive relief," Susan announced, her voice carrying easily over the soft jazz music playing in the background. "We always knew that girl was a terrible mistake for our Preston. She never truly understood our world, and she always lacked the proper ambition." Richard nodded in complete agreement, adjusting his expensive silk tie and puffing out his chest. "You cannot teach class to people who come from nothing," Richard added with a disgusting sneer on his face. "She and her mother were basically charity cases that our son generously supported out of the absolute kindness of his own heart. Now that he is taking his massive company public, he simply needs a woman beside him who actually knows how to behave in high society." The wealthy friends murmured in polite agreement, completely enabling the toxic racism and vicious classism flowing freely from the Whitman family. They clinked their crystal glasses together, toasting to Preston's upcoming public offering and celebrating the absolute destruction of my daughter's life. They were all so incredibly comfortable in their bubble of immense privilege that they could not sense the massive storm rapidly gathering right outside their luxurious doors. They truly thought the Sterling women were completely defeated, broken, and entirely removed from the grand equation of their perfect lives. They continued to loudly mock the community art center my daughter had poured her heart into, calling it a pathetic little hobby for a woman who could not secure a real job. Susan even dared to make a cruel joke about how Maya would probably have to start taking the public bus back to the South Side by tomorrow morning. Every single toxic word they spoke was a testament to their profound ignorance and their total lack of basic human empathy. They were entirely blinded by their own inherited wealth, and they completely failed to realize that true power does not need to constantly boast or tear down innocent people. Just as Preston raised his glass to make another loud, arrogant toast to his own fabricated brilliance, the energy in the massive ballroom completely shifted. The heavy mahogany doors at the main entrance were pushed open by two uniformed hotel staff members. The soft jazz music playing in the background suddenly seemed to fade away into absolute nothingness. The loud, arrogant chatter of the wealthy elite died down instantly, starting from the back of the room and rippling forward like a massive wave of pure, silent shock. Every single head in the grand ballroom slowly turned toward the entrance. Preston paused with his champagne glass halfway to his mouth, his arrogant smile completely freezing on his face. Standing perfectly still in the grand doorway was my beautiful daughter Maya. She was not wearing the cheap, outdated clothes Preston had demanded she wear. She was not crying, and she was not broken. She was an absolute vision of pure, terrifying power. Maya was draped in a breathtaking custom haute couture gown made of shimmering dark emerald fabric that perfectly complemented her beautiful brown skin. The dress was a true masterpiece of high fashion, wrapping around her strong figure and flowing gracefully all the way to the polished marble floor. She wore a stunning diamond choker that caught the light of the massive chandeliers, sending brilliant flashes of white fire across the silent room. Her hair was styled perfectly, and her makeup was absolutely flawless. But the most striking thing about her was the incredibly fierce look in her dark eyes. She did not look like a defeated wife coming to beg for mercy. She looked exactly like a conquering queen stepping onto a battlefield that she already completely owned. The entire room stopped breathing. The wealthy socialites, who had just been loudly mocking her, now stared in absolute stunned silence. Preston felt a massive surge of pure rage boil up inside his chest. His perfect moment of supreme public triumph was being entirely ruined by the very woman he thought he had crushed. He slammed his crystal champagne glass down onto a silver tray so hard that the delicate stem snapped completely in half. Chloe gasped and stepped back as Preston aggressively signaled for his private security team. The head of security, a massive man wearing a dark tailored suit and a visible earpiece, immediately rushed over to his boss. Preston pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Maya, who was now walking slowly and confidently down the center of the grand ballroom. "Throw her out of my gala right this exact second," Preston screamed, his face turning a deep, violent shade of red. "She is completely unauthorized to be inside this building. Grab her by the arms and drag her out into the street." The massive security chief nodded firmly and began marching directly toward my daughter, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the marble floor. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, waiting eagerly for the violent public humiliation he had so desperately craved. But right before the security chief could even reach out his large hands to touch Maya, he suddenly stopped dead in his tracks. The large man pressed his thick fingers tightly against his secret earpiece, listening intensely to an urgent message coming through the hidden radio channel. The color completely drained from the security chief's rough face, leaving him looking incredibly pale and terrified. He immediately took 3 large steps backward away from Maya. "I said throw her out!" Preston screamed. "I cannot, sir. She is the guest of the chairwoman." The massive head of security took another cautious step backward, his face completely devoid of any color. He looked at Preston with a mixture of profound fear and total helpless confusion. Preston stared at his own employee, his mouth hanging slightly open as his arrogant brain violently struggled to process the completely impossible words he had just heard. "The guest of the chairwoman." Preston repeated, his voice sounding incredibly weak and hollow over the soft background noise of the grand ballroom. Before Preston could even attempt to comprehend what those words actually meant, a sudden and powerful shift occurred at the massive mahogany doors of the main entrance. The heavy wooden doors were pushed open entirely wide by 2 additional security guards who stood at absolute military attention. The remaining crowd of wealthy socialites and arrogant corporate executives who were still gathered near the grand entryway immediately parted. They physically moved out of the way, splitting perfectly down the middle, like the Red Sea parting to create a wide, clear path directly through the center of the opulent room. The absolute silence that had followed Maya's breathtaking arrival somehow grew even deeper and much heavier. And then I finally walked right through the grand entrance. I was absolutely no longer the simple older lady who drove a 10-year-old car and spent her quiet afternoons pruning rose bushes in the suburbs. I was no longer the poor widow from the South Side who wore cheap faded floral dresses and kept her head bowed down in polite forced humility. I had shed that carefully constructed disguise completely and forever. I stepped onto the polished marble floor of the Plaza Hotel ballroom draped in my stunning, custom-tailored navy blue silk gown. The incredibly expensive fabric moved around me like flowing water radiating absolute wealth and terrifying, unquestionable authority. The heavy, brilliant diamonds resting against my collarbone caught the bright light of the massive crystal chandeliers, sending sharp, blinding flashes of pure white fire dancing across the quiet room. I held my head incredibly high, my posture perfectly straight, and my expression completely devoid of any warmth or mercy. I looked exactly like the billionaire corporate titan that I truly was, but I did not walk into that massive ballroom alone. I was flanked by a highly intimidating entourage that immediately sent shockwaves of pure terror rippling through the wealthy crowd. Walking directly on my right side was Jacqueline, the absolute most ruthless and feared corporate litigation attorney in the entire state of Georgia. She wore a sharp, tailored crimson suit, and her dark eyes scanned the room with the calculated precision of a starving apex predator looking for her next meal. Walking proudly on my left side was David, the highly respected chief financial officer of Lumina Innovations, whom Preston had foolishly and illegally fired just a few days prior. Behind us marched a tight unified phalanx of 6 elite corporate lawyers, all wearing perfectly tailored dark suits and carrying heavy leather briefcases filled with irrefutable evidence. The sheer visual impact of our collective arrival was absolutely devastating to the fragile corporate ecosystem of the room. I could physically see the wealthy investors and the arrogant board members holding their breath in completely stunned disbelief. They recognized Jacqueline immediately, and they certainly recognized David, but they could not figure out why the most powerful legal executioner in the city and a recently terminated financial officer were aggressively flanking an unknown black woman wearing millions of dollars in custom jewelry. I began my slow, deliberate walk down the long, wide center aisle that the crowd had desperately cleared for me. My expensive heels clicked rhythmically against the polished marble floor, sounding like the steady ticking of a massive, heavy clock counting down the final remaining seconds of Preston's fabricated life. Maya, my beautiful brave daughter, stepped gracefully to the side and joined my formidable procession as I walked past her. She fell exactly into step, right behind me, her head held high, and a fiercely proud smile playing perfectly on her beautiful lips. Together, the Sterling women marched directly toward the main stage like an unstoppable force of sheer corporate nature. Preston was physically trembling. His entire body was shaking so violently that the expensive champagne in his crystal glass was spilling heavily over the rim and splashing darkly onto his custom velvet tuxedo jacket. His pale blue eyes were practically bulging out of his head as he stared at me in a state of complete and utter terrifying shock. He recognized my face, but his incredibly small, arrogant mind simply could not reconcile the poor, humble mother-in-law he loved to humiliate with the terrifying, wealthy matriarch currently walking toward him like a conquering queen. Chloe, the mistress, had physically shrunk back, hiding behind Preston's shaking frame, her face completely ashen and her eyes wide with sudden, undeniable panic. As I confidently approached the front section of the grand ballroom, the absolute silence was suddenly broken by a loud, incredibly shrill voice. It was Susan Whitman, Preston's horribly arrogant and deeply racist mother. Her deeply entitled brain simply could not handle the massive, unexplainable shift in the power dynamic occurring right in front of her eyes. She refused to accept the reality that the woman she had viciously mocked just a few days ago was now commanding the absolute total attention of the entire room. Susan forcefully pushed her way through a small group of wealthy country club friends and stepped aggressively into the center aisle, completely blocking my clear path to the main stage. She clutched her heavy emerald necklace with one hand and pointed her empty champagne glass at me with the other. Her face was twisted into an ugly, bitter sneer. Evelyn Susan laughed a high-pitched, completely hysterical sound that echoed awkwardly through the silent ballroom. "What on earth do you think you are doing here right now? Are you completely insane? Did you seriously steal a nice dress and sneak your way into this building through the back catering entrance? Security needs to come over here and remove this crazy woman immediately before she ruins my son's incredibly important evening." The entire room collectively gasped at her horrific audacity. The wealthy investors stared at Susan as if she had just lost her absolute mind. I did not stop walking. I did not slow my pace, even for a single fraction of a second. I simply kept my eyes locked entirely forward, looking right through Susan Whitman, as if she was nothing more than a completely invisible piece of totally insignificant garbage floating in the wind. As I stepped right into her personal space, Jacqueline, the ruthless attorney, smoothly stepped slightly forward. Without breaking her own stride, Jacqueline gave Susan a single terrifying warning glare that was so incredibly cold it caused the arrogant older woman to physically recoil in absolute fear. Susan stumbled awkwardly backward, tripping slightly over the hem of her own tight silver gown and nearly falling completely onto the hard marble floor. Richard Whitman hastily grabbed his wife's arm to steady her, his own face completely pale and sweating profusely. He was the only person in the Whitman family who knew about the mysterious acquisition of their massive personal debts, and looking at me right now, he was finally beginning to connect the terrifying, horrific dots. I ignored the Whitmans completely and walked directly past them, continuing my steady, deliberate march toward the grand main stage. I gracefully climbed the 4 carpeted steps leading up to the elevated platform. The remaining Lumina Innovations executives, who were standing nervously near the podium, immediately scattered like terrified little mice running away from a massive hungry hawk. They rushed down the opposite stairs, abandoning Preston entirely. I walked directly over to the polished wooden podium standing dead center in the middle of the brightly lit stage. I placed both of my hands firmly on the smooth edges of the podium and looked out over the massive sea of stunned faces. The entire room was completely paralyzed. Nobody dared to take a single sip of their drinks. Nobody dared to whisper a single word to their neighbors. They were all completely captivated, absolutely frozen by the overwhelming heavy presence I commanded from the stage. I looked down directly at Preston, who was standing just a few feet away on the floor below the stage. He was sweating heavily, his breathing shallow and incredibly rapid. He looked exactly like a small, frightened animal caught squarely in the blinding headlights of a massive speeding truck. He opened his mouth to speak, to try and assert some tiny shred of his fabricated authority, but absolutely no sound came out of his throat. I slowly reached out my right hand and gently tapped the metal mesh of the silver microphone standing directly in front of me. The sharp, heavy sound echoed loudly across the massive grand ballroom, cutting through the thick, heavy silence like a razor-sharp knife. "Good evening," I said, my voice completely calm, incredibly smooth, and echoing powerfully through the state-of-the-art sound system. I looked out over the wealthy crowd, making sure to make direct eye contact with the most important investors and the most powerful board members in the room. I know that this is supposed to be a very festive corporate celebration, but there has been a massive fundamental change in the leadership of this company today. I paused for a brief second, letting the absolute heavy weight of my words sink deeply into their completely terrified minds. I looked back down at Preston, locking my eyes directly onto his entirely defeated, pale face. "For those of you in this room who do not know me," I continued, my voice rising slightly in pure, absolute authority, "my name is Evelyn Sterling. I am the sole founder and the primary chief executive of Sterling Vanguard." The name of my massive holding company caused an immediate, violent physical reaction throughout the entire crowd. Gasps erupted from the wealthy investors. Frantic whispers broke out among the senior corporate executives, who knew exactly how much raw, terrifying financial power the Sterling Vanguard name truly commanded. I leaned slightly closer to the silver microphone, my dark eyes completely burning with a righteous absolute fury that had been building quietly for 7 long years. "And I am the sole private owner of this entire company," I stated clearly and loudly. The profound, absolute silence that immediately followed my massive revelation was incredibly deafening. It was the heavy, completely suffocating silence of an entire fabricated world completely and instantly collapsing in on itself. The arrogant executives, the wealthy socialites, the racist mother-in-law, and the cruel, cheating husband all completely shattered under the massive, crushing weight of the absolute, undisputed truth. Preston Whitman stood completely frozen, his eyes incredibly wide and perfectly round with absolute pure terror. His fingers violently trembled, and then they completely lost their grip entirely. The crystal champagne glass slipped right through his sweating fingers. It plummeted directly downward and hit the hard, polished marble floor right at his feet. The glass shattered into 1,000 tiny broken pieces, the loud, sharp sound echoing perfectly throughout the completely dead, silent room. The sound of the shattered champagne glass seemed to hang in the heavy air for an absolute eternity. Preston stared blankly at the broken crystal resting at his expensive leather shoes, and then he slowly looked back up at me, standing firmly behind the podium. His small, arrogant brain simply refused to accept the terrifying reality of the massive situation unfolding right in front of him. He let out a loud, forced laugh that sounded completely unhinged and entirely desperate. "This is a joke," he shouted loudly, his voice cracking slightly as he frantically looked around the dead silent ballroom, desperately hoping someone would laugh along with him. "This is some kind of sick, elaborate prank. You are just Evelyn. You bake pies for the church bake sale. You drive a beat-up old car, and you live in a tiny little house on the south side. You do not own this massive tech company. You do not own absolutely anything. You are just a sad, bitter old woman trying to ruin my incredibly important night because you are deeply jealous of my massive corporate success." He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Jacqueline and David, who were standing completely still beside me. "And you too," he yelled, practically spitting his angry words across the room. "I do not know exactly how much money she paid you to play along with this pathetic little stunt, but I'm going to have both of you permanently disbarred and completely blacklisted from this entire lucrative industry. You are all trespassing on my corporate property. Security, I ordered you to remove these crazy people right now." The massive head of security did not move a single muscle. He just kept his eyes glued firmly to the polished marble floor, entirely terrified to even breathe heavily in my general direction. The wealthy crowd watched in absolute horrified fascination as Preston completely unraveled right in front of their very eyes. Richard and Susan Whitman stood entirely frozen near the center aisle, their faces completely drained of all human color. Susan had her hand clamped tightly over her mouth, realizing that she had just openly insulted a woman who held absolute power over their entire family fortune. I did not raise my voice or show a single ounce of petty anger. True absolute power never ever has to explain itself to a desperate crying coward. I simply raised my right hand and gave a very small, deliberate nod to the audio-visual technicians stationed high up in the control booth at the very back of the massive ballroom. I had actually secretly purchased this exact luxury hotel 3 years ago through a subsidiary, so the entire hotel staff knew exactly who they were truly working for tonight. Immediately, the bright glowing lights of the massive crystal chandeliers dimmed down to a very low atmospheric glow, causing the entire crowd to instantly murmur in quiet confusion. The massive floor-to-ceiling television screens that were originally meant to display Preston's highly arrogant corporate promotional videos suddenly flickered to life. The massive screens illuminated the entire dark room with a harsh, bright white light. Every single wealthy investor, socialite, and executive in the grand ballroom turned their absolute full attention to the massive digital displays. I leaned slightly forward into the silver microphone. "You are absolutely right about one tiny thing, Preston," I said smoothly, my voice echoing perfectly through the pristine sound system. "I do genuinely love baking pies for my local church. But what you completely fail to realize is exactly what I do with the rest of my quiet time. Look very closely at the giant screens behind me, little boy. Read the legal documents very carefully before you speak another foolish word. Displayed in massive high-definition text was the official unredacted state corporate registry and full ownership lineage for Lumina Innovations. The wealthy crowd gasped collectively as they rapidly read the incredibly detailed legal filings. The massive documents clearly showed that exactly 7 years ago, a highly secretive private equity firm named Sterling Vanguard had quietly purchased a complete controlling interest in the small, struggling tech startup that would eventually become the massive Lumina Innovations. The signature at the very bottom of the primary corporate acquisition document was blown up to massive proportions for the entire room to see clearly. It clearly read, "Evelyn Sterling, primary founder and sole chief executive officer." I bought this entire company exactly 7 years ago. I explained, my voice echoing powerfully through the completely silent room. I bought it long before you ever even dreamed of becoming a wealthy chief executive officer. When my beautiful, incredibly talented daughter Maya first brought you home and told me she truly loved you, I knew I needed to make absolutely sure you were genuinely worthy of holding her precious heart. I knew from decades of experience that massive wealth and sudden corporate power were the absolute ultimate tests of a man's true inner character. So I quietly used my private holding company to secretly place you in a mid-level management position right here at Lumina. I specifically instructed the Human Resources Department to promote you rapidly based solely on your aggressive sales tactics and your endless ambition. I intentionally gave you the absolute highest level of executive corporate authority over time. I handed you the golden keys to my entire massive kingdom just to see exactly what kind of terrible man you would instantly become when you thought absolutely nobody was watching you. Preston was completely pale, his mouth opening and closing repeatedly like a suffocating fish pulled violently from the water. He stared up at the massive bright screens, reading the undeniable legal proof of his completely fabricated reality. The documents kept shifting and changing on the giant screens behind me, orchestrated perfectly by David, the brilliant financial officer you had foolishly fired. They now prominently showed the highly secret proxy voting records where I had personally authorized and approved every single one of your massive salary raises and every single one of your completely unearned executive performance bonuses. I watched you very closely for 5 entire years. Preston, I continued, my voice growing much colder and significantly heavier with every single word I spoke. I watched you happily take complete, absolute credit for the incredibly hard work of your brilliant, dedicated employees. I watched you treat the hard-working support staff like they were absolute garbage beneath your expensive shoes. I watched you become entirely consumed by your own endless, massive, fragile ego. But most importantly, I watched exactly how you treated my beautiful daughter. I watched you completely drain her beautiful creative spirit. I watched you cruelly force her to shrink her entire life down just so you could feel slightly taller in your own pathetic mind. You truly thought you were building a massive, untouchable corporate empire, but you were actually just walking blindly through a carefully constructed invisible maze that I built exclusively and specifically to trap you. The giant screens shifted again now, displaying a highly detailed chronological timeline of his recent entirely fraudulent financial transactions. The wealthy crowd began to murmur incredibly loudly, pointing directly at the screens in absolute, genuine shock. They saw the massive wire transfers he had illegally authorized using restricted company funds. I gave you every single financial resource a man could ever possibly dream of having, I said, staring directly down into his completely terrified, pale eyes. I gave you massive wealth, high social status, and a beautiful, fiercely loyal wife who loved you completely and unconditionally. And you took all of those incredible, beautiful blessings, and you chose to act like a weak, pathetic, selfish coward. You failed the ultimate test, Preston. You failed miserably as a business leader. You failed completely as a loving husband. And tonight, standing here in front of the entire city, you have completely and entirely failed as a human being. Preston slowly fell completely to his shaking knees, the expensive custom velvet tuxedo pants hitting the hard, polished marble floor with an incredibly heavy, sad thud. He could not even manage to look at me anymore. He just stared blankly at the shattered champagne glass resting on the floor, completely broken by the absolute, overwhelming, crushing reality of his total public destruction. The wealthy investors and board members in the room were now actively, physically backing away from him, as if he was carrying a highly contagious, incredibly deadly disease. They knew their own massive wealth was directly tied to my holding company, and they wanted absolutely nothing to do with the pathetic man I was currently actively destroying. I slowly shifted my cold gaze away from the pathetic, crying man kneeling on the floor. I turned my absolute, terrifying attention directly to the left side of the room, where Chloe, the arrogant vice president of marketing, was desperately trying to hide her body behind a large, decorative floral arrangement. She was visibly shaking her hands, clutching her stolen diamond necklace as if the cold stones could somehow magically protect her from my absolute righteous wrath. I pointed my index finger directly at her. The bright stage spotlight shifted instantly, illuminating her completely for the entire grand ballroom to see clearly. "And you?" I said, my voice slicing easily through the heavy, tense air. "Chloe, the brilliant, highly ambitious vice president of marketing. You truly thought you could just sleep your way directly to the very top of my massive company. You thought you could happily wear my daughter's stolen vintage jewelry and threaten her with completely fabricated digital emails. You thought you were so incredibly clever, playing your dirty little corporate games and destroying an innocent marriage." Chloe let out a loud, pathetic sobbing noise. "Please," she begged, her voice shaking uncontrollably as tears streamed heavily down her heavily made-up face. "Please, Mrs. Sterling, I really did not know the truth. I swear I had absolutely no idea who you truly were. He told me he owned absolutely everything. He told me Maya was completely crazy and unstable. I am so incredibly sorry for everything." I smiled, a completely cold and absolutely terrifying smile that carried zero mercy. "Ignorance is never a valid excuse for absolute cruelty." "Chloe," I replied smoothly, looking down at her ruined silver dress. "You made your terrible choices entirely on your own free will. You willingly and happily participated in the cruel destruction of my daughter's marriage, and you happily accepted millions of dollars in stolen corporate funds to buy your fancy new penthouse. Therefore, effective immediately, right this very second, you are officially terminated from Lumina Innovations. You are completely fired without any severance whatsoever." Chloe let out a loud, dramatic, wailing scream, collapsing heavily against the large floral arrangement. I did not show her a single tiny ounce of pity or mercy. I looked directly over at the massive head of security, who was still standing nervously near the front of the quiet room, waiting for his true boss to give the final, ultimate order. "Security," I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute, unquestionable global corporate authority. "Escort this former employee off my private property right this exact second. She is no longer welcome in this building or any other commercial building owned by Sterling Vanguard anywhere in the world." The massive security chief finally moved with incredible purpose. He walked very quickly over to Chloe, grabbing her firmly by her bare arm. "No, please, no!" Chloe screamed loudly, thrashing wildly in her tight, expensive silver gown. "You cannot do this to me in front of everyone. I have a professional career. I have a society reputation." The tall security chief ignored her entirely. Another large guard rushed over to assist him immediately, and together they physically dragged the screaming, crying mistress straight down the long center aisle of the massive grand ballroom. Her incredibly expensive high heels scraped loudly and awkwardly against the polished marble floor, leaving black scuff marks. The entire massive crowd of wealthy socialites and arrogant corporate investors watched in absolute stunned silence as the woman who truly thought she was the beautiful, untouchable queen of the evening was humiliatingly dragged out the grand mahogany doors, exactly like absolute unwanted trash. When the heavy wooden doors finally slammed shut heavily behind her, the pathetic screaming completely stopped. The grand, opulent ballroom was absolutely dead silent once again. I turned my absolute terrifying focus entirely back to the pathetic, ruined man still kneeling and crying on the floor. The real boardroom massacre had only just begun, and he was about to lose absolutely everything else. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the grand ballroom remained firmly shut after the screaming mistress was dragged away into the night. The absolute silence in the room was completely suffocating as hundreds of wealthy investors and corporate board members turned their collective attention back to the massive stage. Preston Whitman was still kneeling on the cold, polished marble floor, looking completely broken and utterly humiliated. But arrogant men who have been shielded by wealth their entire lives simply do not know how to surrender gracefully. As the sheer shock began to wear off, a desperate, defensive anger began to bubble up inside his chest. He slowly pushed himself off the floor, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo now wrinkled and stained with spilled champagne. He stood up on his shaking legs and desperately tried to puff out his chest, attempting to reclaim a tiny shred of his fabricated corporate authority. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his trembling hand and glared up at me with absolute pure hatred. "Fine," he shouted, his voice cracking loudly in the silent room. "Fire me right now, Evelyn. Go ahead and terminate my employment if it makes you feel like a powerful woman. I do not care about this stupid company anymore anyway, but you're going to pay me an absolute fortune to let me go. I am the chief executive officer, and I have an ironclad executive employment contract. It has a massive golden parachute clause designed specifically to protect me from hostile takeovers and sudden terminations. If you fire me tonight, you legally owe me a severance package of exactly $20 million. Preston crossed his arms over his chest, trying incredibly hard to look like a victorious corporate titan who had just brilliantly outsmarted his enemy. He actually believed that he was going to walk out of that grand ballroom a wildly wealthy man, despite everything he had done. He thought the $20 million would easily allow him to start over somewhere else and continue living his arrogant, luxurious lifestyle completely free from my absolute control. A low murmur rippled through the wealthy crowd as the investors digested his massive financial demand. They knew how ironclad those specific executive contracts usually were, and they briefly wondered if the corrupt man was actually going to escape his own destruction with a massive payout. I did not flinch or show a single ounce of concern. I simply looked down at him and smiled a very slow and incredibly dangerous mother's smile. It was the kind of cold, terrifying smile that instantly communicated absolute, total doom. "You really should have read your own employment contract much more carefully, Preston," I said, my voice perfectly smooth and echoing with absolute terrifying authority. "If you had actually bothered to read the legal documents you proudly signed 5 years ago, you would be very familiar with Section 4, Paragraph B. I gestured toward Jacqueline, the ruthless corporate attorney standing firmly by my side. Jacqueline stepped forward and picked up a thick legal folder from the polished wooden podium. She opened the folder and read directly from the official corporate document, her sharp voice carrying easily across the massive, quiet ballroom. Clause 4B explicitly states that any chief executive officer immediately and entirely forfeits all severance packages, golden parachutes, and unvested stock options in the event of gross professional negligence or deliberate corporate embezzlement, Jacqueline announced clearly. Preston scoffed loudly, rolling his pale eyes and waving his hand in the air dismissively. "You have absolutely no proof of any embezzlement." He lied, his voice filled with a desperate, hollow arrogance. "I have managed the finances of this massive company perfectly. You cannot just invent fake crimes to steal my $20 million severance package." I nodded slowly at David, the brilliant financial officer, who was standing proudly on my other side. David immediately pulled a small remote control from his suit pocket and pressed a single button. The massive digital screens behind me shifted instantly, completely replacing the corporate ownership documents with highly detailed internal banking records. The bright white light from the giant screens illuminated Preston's terrified face as his absolute worst nightmare suddenly became a very public reality. The giant screens displayed the exact internal wire transfers Preston had illegally authorized just a few days ago. Every single wealthy investor in the grand ballroom could clearly read the massive multi-million-dollar transaction routed directly from the restricted corporate reserve fund into a private real estate holding account. "Let us talk about your perfect financial management, Preston," I said, my voice turning incredibly cold and entirely unforgiving. "Just 48 hours ago, you deliberately bypassed internal security protocols to wire millions of dollars of company money to purchase a luxury downtown penthouse for your pathetic little mistress. You actively committed federal corporate fraud, and you arrogantly labeled the theft as an executive retention bonus. You truly believed that the anonymous board of directors was completely blind, but I was watching every single keystroke you made. I personally approved the transfer to go through just so we would have the undeniable federal evidence required to completely and utterly destroy your entire life." The wealthy crowd gasped in absolute, genuine horror. Embezzling corporate funds was the one single crime that rich investors absolutely never forgave. Preston's reputation evaporated instantly and completely in that exact terrifying second. He was no longer a respected technology executive in their eyes. He was just a common, arrogant thief who had actively stolen their personal investments to buy real estate for his cheating partner. Preston stared up at the massive bank records, his mouth hanging completely open in silent, absolute terror. He suddenly realized that he was not going to get a $20 million golden parachute today. He was going to get absolutely nothing at all. He was entirely broke and heavily burdened by massive debts he could no longer possibly pay. The sudden crushing weight of his absolute financial annihilation finally hit him, causing his knees to buckle slightly once again. But the absolute carnage in that grand ballroom was not entirely finished yet. As Preston stood there completely paralyzed by his total financial ruin, my sharp eyes caught a sudden subtle movement near the back of the massive room. Richard and Susan Whitman, the incredibly arrogant and deeply racist parents who had enabled their son's terrible behavior for his entire life, were quietly attempting to escape the incredibly humiliating scene. They were slowly backing away from the crowd, trying desperately to slip unnoticed through a side exit door near the catering tables. Susan had her heavy emerald necklace clutched tightly in her shaking hand, and her head was bowed down in absolute total shame. They wanted to run away and hide in their massive Buckhead mansion, pretending that none of this terrifying reality was actually happening to their perfect wealthy family. I leaned forward into the silver microphone, my dark eyes locking directly onto their retreating figures. The entire crowd of wealthy socialites instantly turned around to stare directly at the terrified older couple, exposing them to everyone watching. Richard and Susan completely froze, looking exactly like frightened criminals caught entirely red-handed. They slowly turned around to face the main stage, their faces completely drained of all color and shining with cold, terrified sweat. Susan kept her eyes glued to the marble floor, entirely unable to look at the powerful black woman she had previously treated like absolute common garbage. I looked directly down at Richard, remembering the incredible arrogance he had displayed when he stood in my modest garden and tried to buy my daughter's entire life for a pathetic sum of money just days ago today. "Richard, Susan, leaving so soon?" I asked, my voice echoing loudly and stopping them completely dead in their tracks. "We need to discuss the foreclosure on your estate." Richard swallowed very hard, his throat bobbing visibly in the bright ballroom light. "Please, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice incredibly weak and completely pathetic. "Please do not do this right now in front of our friends." I ignored his pathetic begging entirely. "You arrogantly handed me a certified bank check for $100,000, thinking you were an untouchable titan tossing meaningless scraps to a completely poor, starving older single woman. But you made a catastrophic financial calculation that morning, Richard. Remember that check you gave me? It helped me buy your debt. I had my elite forensic accountants look deeply into your family finances, and what we discovered was absolutely pathetic. You are entirely leveraged across all your businesses and your personal estates. So I authorized Sterling Vanguard to actively purchase every single outstanding loan and primary mortgage attached to your family name. You and your deeply racist wife are going to lose absolutely everything you have ever owned. You're going to be completely evicted and entirely ruined forever." The absolute crushing reality of his total financial annihilation finally shattered the very last remaining pieces of Preston's fragile, arrogant mind. He was still kneeling awkwardly on the cold, polished marble floor, staring down at the shattered remains of his expensive crystal champagne glass. The incredibly heavy silence in the massive grand ballroom pressed down on him from every single direction. He slowly raised his head and looked directly at his wealthy parents, Richard and Susan Whitman, who were currently standing frozen in absolute pure terror near the side exit doors. He saw the complete, undeniable financial ruin completely washing over their pale, sweating faces. He suddenly realized with absolute horrifying clarity that there was no secret family trust fund to save him today. There was no massive generational wealth waiting to quietly bail him out of his massive legal problems. His parents were entirely broke and heavily leveraged. He was completely broke and publicly humiliated. He had absolutely nothing left in the entire world. The sheer magnitude of this complete, catastrophic failure instantly twisted his pathetic sorrow into a sudden, violent, and completely unhinged rage. He could simply not accept the absolute terrifying truth that he had been entirely defeated by the very women he had spent years actively tearing down and viciously mocking. His pale blue eyes darkened with a terrifying blind fury. He let out a loud, primal, guttural scream that echoed violently across the massive, quiet ballroom, shocking the wealthy crowd of arrogant corporate investors. Preston scrambled desperately to his feet, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo jacket completely ruined, and his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly on the smooth floor. He curled his sweating hands into tight, shaking fists and locked his hateful gaze directly onto me, standing calmly behind the polished wooden podium. He completely lost his mind in that exact, terrifying second. He charged directly toward the grand main stage, moving with a blind, violent momentum. He fully intended to climb those short carpeted stairs and physically attack me right in front of hundreds of incredibly wealthy socialites and highly respected corporate board members. The massive security chief started to move forward to intercept the violent charging man, but another completely unstoppable force intercepted Preston first. Before Preston could even reach the very bottom step of the grand stage, my beautiful, brilliant daughter Maya stepped gracefully and firmly directly into his immediate path. She moved with incredible speed and absolute perfect precision, placing her own body completely between her violent husband and her powerful mother. Maya did not flinch or show a single tiny ounce of fear. She stood perfectly straight and incredibly tall, her breathtaking custom, haute couture emerald gown flowing heavily around her feet like a massive pool of dark green liquid silk. The heavy, brilliant diamond choker around her neck sparkled brightly under the massive crystal chandeliers, but the bright, cold fire in her dark eyes was significantly more intimidating. Preston slammed on his invisible brakes, his expensive shoes skidding loudly against the polished marble, stopping just a few short inches away from my daughter's absolutely fearless face. He was breathing incredibly heavily, his chest heaving up and down his face, completely flushed with dark, angry blood. He raised his shaking hand as if he was actually going to strike her again, exactly like he had done in their luxury master bedroom just a few short days ago. But Maya did not back down or cower in fear. She simply stared him right in his completely unhinged eyes, radiating an absolute terrifying power that she had entirely inherited from me. "You slapped me in my own house, Preston," Maya said, her voice incredibly low, but carrying a completely devastating weight that echoed clearly into the microphones above us. "You put your hands on me in the very home I helped you build. You looked me right in my eyes and you told me that I was absolutely nothing without you. You honestly believed that your massive wealth and your completely fabricated corporate authority gave you the ultimate right to treat me like a piece of meaningless, disposable garbage." Preston stood there shaking violently, his arms still half raised in the tense air, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming absolute strength projecting from his incredibly beautiful wife. Maya slowly reached her elegant hand into the hidden silk pocket of her stunning emerald gown. She pulled out a thick, perfectly folded stack of legal documents. They were the exact same emergency divorce papers that his own corrupt corporate lawyers had aggressively shoved into her hands outside her community art center. She unfolded the thick legal documents and held them directly up to his sweating pale face. "You drafted these completely unfair legal papers." Preston Maya continued, her voice perfectly steady and absolutely devoid of any human sympathy. "You specifically instructed your expensive lawyers to write a completely ironclad separation agreement that heavily favored your own massive greed. You demanded full, absolute ownership of the massive Buckhead mansion. You demanded complete, total control of all the joint investment accounts and the luxury vehicles. You even tried to steal my small community art center and destroy my frozen embryos just to inflict maximum emotional pain. You wrote a completely binding legal clause stating that upon the immediate signing of these documents, each individual party would permanently retain exactly what they currently own right now in this exact specific moment. You wanted me to walk away with absolutely nothing while you happily kept your entire massive empire." Preston stared blankly at the thick legal documents, entirely unable to comprehend why she was holding them up right now. He swallowed hard, his arrogant mind completely short-circuiting under the intense pressure. Maya smiled a very slow, completely cold, and absolutely devastating smile. It was the exact same dangerous smile I had taught her to use when destroying arrogant, corrupt men. "I signed them," Preston Maya announced, her voice ringing clearly and beautifully across the massive, dead silent ballroom. "I signed every single page exactly like you aggressively demanded. I did not contest a single unfair clause. I did not ask for a single penny of your massive corporate salary or your unvested stock options. I gave you exactly what you wanted today." Maya aggressively shoved the signed legal documents directly against his completely ruined velvet tuxedo chest. Preston instinctively brought his shaking hands up to grab the thick papers, clutching them tightly against his wildly beating heart. "You keep exactly what you legally own right now in this specific exact moment," Maya declared, looking directly into his completely broken, terrified eyes. "Which, according to my mother's incredibly expensive elite corporate lawyers, is absolutely nothing at all. You currently own $0, Preston. Your personal bank accounts are completely frozen. Your luxury mansion is entirely owned by Sterling Vanguard. Your employment is officially terminated, and your massive severance package is completely legally voided. You own absolutely nothing, and therefore you walk away from this 5-year marriage with exactly nothing." The absolute ultimate reality of her brilliant legal maneuver hit him like a massive heavy freight train traveling at incredibly high speeds. He had entirely trapped himself in his own greedy legal snare. He had arrogantly demanded a contract that protected current individual assets, completely forgetting that I had the absolute ultimate power to strip him of every single asset he falsely claimed to own before the documents were ever officially filed. He looked down at the signed divorce papers in his shaking hands, realizing that they were completely useless to him now. They were nothing but a legally binding guarantee of his own absolute total permanent poverty. He let out a soft, pathetic whimpering sound, completely losing the very last tiny shred of his fabricated corporate dignity. Maya stepped slightly to the side, entirely dismissing his pathetic existence. She turned her beautiful back on him and walked gracefully up the short carpeted stairs to stand directly beside me on the grand main stage. The wealthy crowd of incredibly powerful corporate investors watched in absolute, completely stunned silence as the brilliant, beautiful daughter permanently finalized the absolute destruction of her corrupt, arrogant husband. Preston slowly sank back down to his shaking knees on the hard, cold marble floor, holding the signed divorce documents tightly against his chest, as if they could magically protect him from the massive storm that was entirely consuming his life. The thick, heavy silence in the grand ballroom was completely overwhelming. Everyone simply stared at the broken man who had arrogantly believed he was an untouchable billionaire just 30 short minutes ago. Richard and Susan Whitman, the completely disgraced and heavily indebted parents, could only watch from the distant shadows, entirely unable to help their deeply flawed son. They knew their own massive financial ruin was equally as permanent and absolutely devastating. Preston began to quietly sob, his tears falling heavily onto the legal papers, completely smudging the dark blue ink of Maya's elegant signature. He was crying for himself entirely, for his own massive lost wealth and his completely shattered massive ego. He did not feel a single tiny ounce of genuine remorse for the terrible way he had cruelly treated my incredibly beautiful daughter. He was simply mourning the sudden violent death of his completely fabricated luxurious lifestyle. I watched him cry from my elevated position on the grand stage, feeling absolutely no pity or mercy in my heavy heart. I had specifically designed this entire massive corporate trap to ensure that his punishment perfectly matched his own arrogant greed. He had wanted to leave my daughter entirely destitute and publicly humiliated, and now he was exactly experiencing that exact same terrifying fate entirely on his own. The absolute complete finality of the situation hung heavily in the air, wrapping around the wealthy crowd and permanently changing the absolute fundamental power dynamics of the entire city. Maya stood tall and proud right beside me, her stunning diamonds catching the bright light, a true victorious queen who had successfully survived a terrible storm and emerged incredibly stronger. The incredibly heavy and absolutely suffocating silence that had entirely consumed the massive grand ballroom was suddenly completely shattered by a very loud, aggressive pounding noise coming directly from the main entrance. The massive, thick mahogany doors that had previously swung open to reveal my own dramatic entrance were now being violently forced open from the outside. A massive group of incredibly stern-looking men and women marched aggressively into the opulent room. They were not wearing expensive custom-tailored tuxedos or stunning custom haute couture designer gowns. They were wearing dark, completely practical windbreakers with massive, bright yellow letters printed clearly across the back reading FBI. The Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially arrived at the Lumina Innovations corporate gala, and they were moving with absolute terrifying tactical precision. The wealthy crowd of highly respected corporate board members and arrogant socialites immediately gasped in complete, absolute horror, actively scrambling backward and entirely clearing a massive wide path for the advancing federal agents. I stood perfectly still behind the polished wooden podium on the grand main stage, watching the federal agents approach with a completely calm and deeply satisfied expression on my face. Earlier that exact same afternoon, after David, the brilliant financial officer, had successfully handed over the small silver flash drive containing the undeniable digital proof of Preston's massive corporate embezzlement, I had personally ensured that the highly sensitive evidence was immediately delivered directly to the highest-ranking federal authorities in the city. The digital drive contained absolutely perfect, completely unassailable forensic records of his illegal wire transfers, his completely fraudulent executive retention bonus claims, and his completely unauthorized usage of heavily restricted corporate reserve funds to purchase private real estate for his cheating mistress. It was an absolutely perfect, open-and-shut criminal case of massive corporate fraud, wrapped entirely in a beautiful, shiny silver bow. The lead federal agent, a tall, incredibly imposing man with sharp, cold eyes, walked directly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom, his heavy boots thudding loudly against the polished marble floor. He was flanked by 6 other heavily armed agents, who immediately began securing the various exits of the massive room, entirely preventing anyone from attempting a sudden desperate escape. Richard and Susan Whitman, the completely ruined, arrogant parents, physically pressed their shaking bodies flat against the decorative wallpaper near the catering tables, entirely terrified that they might also be actively arrested for their own massive financial crimes. The lead federal agent completely ignored the wealthy crowd and marched straight toward the front of the room, where Preston Whitman was still currently kneeling pathetically on the floor, tightly clutching the entirely worthless signed divorce papers against his completely ruined velvet tuxedo chest. Preston looked up through his incredibly blurry, tear-filled eyes, completely failing to understand exactly what was happening right in front of him. His small, arrogant brain was entirely unable to process any further terrifying trauma tonight. When he finally noticed the massive bright yellow letters on the agents' dark jackets, a completely new and entirely overwhelming level of pure, absolute terror instantly flooded his entire nervous system. He scrambled frantically backward on his hands and knees, his expensive leather shoes slipping awkwardly against the hard floor. He looked wildly around the massive, silent ballroom, completely desperate for anyone, to magically intervene and save him from his absolute impending doom. He looked desperately at his wealthy board members, but they all immediately turned their faces completely away, refusing to even acknowledge his pathetic existence. He looked desperately toward his parents, but they were entirely frozen in pure, absolute fear, entirely unable to help him. Finally, in an act of absolute, total, pathetic desperation, Preston turned his shaking body completely toward the grand main stage. He looked directly up at my beautiful, brilliant daughter Maya, who was standing perfectly still, looking down at him with an expression of absolute, complete, cold indifference. Preston actually crawled slightly forward, dragging his completely ruined, expensive tuxedo pants across the hard marble floor. He reached his shaking hands out toward the bottom step of the stage, his face entirely covered in sweat and tears. "Maya, please," he begged, his voice cracking loudly and echoing pathetically through the absolutely dead, silent room. Please, you have to help me, Maya. You have to tell them that this is all just a massive misunderstanding. Please do not let them take me away to federal prison. We were married for 5 years, Maya. You used to love me. Please, you have to save me right now." Maya did not move a single tiny muscle. She simply stared down at the pathetic, broken man, begging desperately at her beautiful feet. She remembered the exact moment he had cruelly slapped her across her face in their luxury master bedroom. She remembered the incredibly vicious words he had used when he completely froze her bank accounts and attempted to illegally lock her out of her own community art center. She remembered the absolute horrific cruelty of his legal attempt to steal and destroy her frozen embryos. She looked at him crawling on the floor like a completely pathetic, weak coward, and she felt absolutely nothing but pure, total liberation. Maya slowly lifted her beautiful, elegant foot and stepped deliberately and smoothly right over his completely outstretched, reaching hands. She walked gracefully down the short, carpeted stairs, entirely ignoring his frantic, pathetic sobbing, and moved to stand perfectly beside Jacqueline, our incredibly ruthless corporate attorney. She completely, entirely, and permanently erased his existence from her beautiful, successful life. The lead federal agent reached Preston and immediately grabbed the arrogant, corrupt executive aggressively by his custom velvet shoulder, pulling him violently up from the polished floor. "Preston Whitman." The agent said, his voice incredibly loud and echoing with absolute terrifying federal authority. "You are currently under full formal arrest for massive federal corporate embezzlement, aggravated wire fraud, and the deliberate misappropriation of restricted corporate funds. You have the absolute right to remain completely silent. Anything you say can and absolutely will be heavily used directly against you in a federal court of law. You have the right to consult with an attorney." Oh. As the federal agent loudly recited his complete Miranda rights, another massive agent stepped firmly behind Preston and aggressively pulled his shaking arms tightly behind his back. The loud, sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly across the massive, silent ballroom. It was the absolute most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire long life. The wealthy Atlanta corporate elite watched in absolute, pure, horrified fascination as their previously untouchable golden boy was entirely physically restrained and completely humiliated right in front of their very own eyes. The illusion of his massive corporate invincibility was completely, instantly, entirely shattered into a million tiny broken pieces, exactly like his expensive crystal champagne glass. Richard and Susan Whitman watched the horrific federal arrest of their only son with absolute, sheer, complete horror. Susan let out a loud, dramatic, wailing gasp, completely sliding down the decorative wallpaper until she was sitting heavily on the floor, burying her completely ruined, arrogant face directly into her shaking hands. Richard simply stared blankly, entirely unable to comprehend how their perfect, wealthy, luxurious life had completely unraveled into absolute, total, permanent ruin in just a few short hours. They knew absolutely perfectly well that they could not possibly afford the massive, expensive legal defense fees required to fight the federal government. They were entirely broke, heavily indebted, and completely, publicly disgraced forever. The federal agents began completely physically dragging Preston away from the grand main stage, actively pulling him directly down the long, wide center aisle toward the massive mahogany exit doors. Preston struggled weakly against their incredibly strong grips, completely destroying the very last tiny shred of his fabricated corporate dignity. As they dragged him directly past the grand main stage, he twisted his shaking head violently around, locking his completely unhinged, terrified eyes directly onto me, standing perfectly calmly behind the polished wooden podium. His face was entirely twisted into a mask of pure, absolute, hateful realization. "You planned this!" he screamed loudly, his voice completely hoarse and echoing wildly across the massive, dead silent ballroom. "You completely planned this entire thing, Evelyn. You set me up. You intentionally let me completely destroy my entire own life. You are an absolute monster." I did not raise my voice or show a single tiny ounce of anger or completely unnecessary emotion. I simply leaned slightly forward into the silver microphone, looking completely, entirely relaxed and incredibly deeply satisfied. 2 minutes after you put your hands violently on my beautiful daughter, your completely pathetic life was entirely over. I replied, my voice perfectly calm and echoing with absolute ultimate finality. The entire rest of this week was simply just completing the completely necessary required legal paperwork. The federal agents aggressively pushed him directly through the massive mahogany doors, entirely removing him from the opulent grand ballroom and completely permanently erasing him from our highly successful, beautiful lives forever. The heavy wooden doors slammed shut loudly, heavily, completely sealing his absolute, terrifying doom. I looked out over the completely silent, terrified crowd of highly wealthy corporate investors and simply smiled, knowing absolutely perfectly well that justice had been completely and entirely served today. After the heavy wooden doors completely slammed shut, sealing his terrifying fate forever, the entire massive grand ballroom remained entirely completely silent. The wealthy elite investors simply stared at the empty space where the corrupt, arrogant executive had just been violently standing. I slowly, calmly stepped completely away from the polished wooden podium, completely satisfied with the absolute, complete destruction of my absolute worst, terrible enemy. Maya walked smoothly, slowly, beautifully right over to me, wrapping her incredibly strong, elegant arms completely tightly around my shoulders. We stood completely, entirely together on the massive grand stage, completely looking out over the absolutely, entirely conquered wealthy corporate kingdom. The shadow chairwoman had completely successfully stepped directly, entirely into the bright, warm, beautiful light, entirely destroying the dark, completely pathetic, corrupt, evil men who dared to deeply, completely hurt her beautiful, incredibly brilliant daughter. The massive, absolute, total, permanent financial, legal, corporate victory was entirely complete today. 3 weeks had passed since the spectacular collapse of the Whitman family at the Grand Corporate Gala. The incredibly swift and entirely brutal financial execution I had initiated was now absolutely complete. Richard and Susan Whitman, the arrogant old money parents who had spent their entire lives looking down on people like me, were completely evicted from their massive $10 million Buckhead mansion. My elite legal team moved with absolute terrifying efficiency to foreclose on every single property and aggressively seize every single liquid asset they possessed. Their wealthy country club friends completely abandoned them entirely, refusing to answer their desperate phone calls or offer even a single dime of financial assistance. Wealthy society only tolerates you when you have power, and the Whitmans were now entirely powerless. With absolutely no money left to their name, Richard and Susan were violently forced to pack their few remaining personal belongings into cheap cardboard boxes and completely relocate to a very different part of the city. They moved directly into a tiny, incredibly run-down one-bedroom apartment located deep in the heart of the South Side. It was exactly the kind of poor, struggling neighborhood they used to viciously mock at their lavish dinner parties. The tiny apartment smelled constantly of stale cigarette smoke and old cooking grease. The thin walls offered absolutely no privacy from the loud noises of the busy street outside. Susan Whitman, the woman who used to proudly wear heavy emerald necklaces and drink vintage champagne, now spent her miserable days wearing cheap, stained sweatpants and crying bitterly on a sagging used sofa. She was completely, entirely broken by the sudden absolute loss of her fabricated high society status. Richard was a completely empty shell of his former arrogant self. He spent his days sitting quietly at a small, wobbly kitchen table, staring blankly at massive stacks of past-due utility bills he could no longer afford to pay. They had finally been forced to experience the exact same harsh, cold reality they had so cruelly wished upon my beautiful daughter. Meanwhile, the incredibly ambitious mistress who had helped destroy my daughter's marriage was experiencing her own absolute total ruin. Chloe, the former highly paid vice president of marketing, had been immediately fired from Lumina Innovations with absolute cause. Her name was completely blacklisted across the entire global corporate technology industry. Absolutely no reputable company would ever dare to hire a woman who had been publicly fired for actively participating in massive federal corporate embezzlement. The luxurious downtown penthouse that Preston had illegally purchased for her using stolen company funds was immediately seized by federal authorities as primary criminal evidence. Chloe was violently evicted and entirely stripped of her stolen wealth. Without her massive corporate salary and completely cut off from Preston's stolen money, Chloe was entirely forced to find menial labor just to survive the harsh reality of her new, entirely ruined life. She was currently working as a basic barista at a small, completely unpretentious local coffee shop. She wore a cheap green apron entirely covered in spilled coffee stains and sour milk. Her incredibly expensive designer clothes were completely gone, replaced by cheap, uncomfortable uniform shoes. Every single day she was forced to stand behind a hot, sticky counter and serve expensive latte drinks to wealthy corporate executives who used to be her direct peers. She had to force a fake polite smile and humbly accept small loose change as tips from people who now looked at her with absolute complete pity and profound disgust. The glorious high society reputation she had so desperately tried to build was completely, utterly destroyed forever. She had traded her entire professional career for a few fleeting moments of stolen luxury, and now she was paying the absolute highest ultimate price for her massive, terrible greed. The absolute complete destruction of Preston Whitman, however, was the most deeply satisfying victory of all. Following his highly public and incredibly humiliating federal arrest at the Grand Gala, Preston was immediately transported directly to the local county detention center. He was entirely stripped of his custom-tailored velvet tuxedo and violently forced to wear a cheap, scratchy, bright orange prison jumpsuit. His expensive leather shoes were replaced with cheap plastic sandals. The federal prosecutors had built an absolutely airtight criminal case against him, using the completely undeniable digital forensic evidence I had personally provided. Because he possessed significant hidden offshore accounts and demonstrated a clear, profound lack of basic human morality, the strict federal judge immediately determined that Preston was a massive, absolute flight risk. He was completely, definitively denied bail. There would be no comfortable house arrest in a luxury mansion for the corrupt, arrogant former chief executive officer. He was entirely forced to await his massive federal corporate fraud trial, sitting alone inside a tiny, cold concrete jail cell. For 3 long weeks, he was completely isolated from the luxurious outside world he had once arrogantly believed he entirely ruled. He was forced to eat terrible, tasteless prison food and sleep on a remarkably thin, hard mattress. His massive, inflated ego was entirely crushed under the heavy, suffocating weight of his absolute, complete, permanent loss of freedom. He was no longer a wealthy, powerful technology titan commanding hundreds of frightened employees. He was just federal inmate number 8472, completely powerless and entirely alone with his own terrible, dark thoughts. I decided to visit him exactly once. I did not go to the county detention center to yell at him or to loudly gloat about my massive total corporate victory. True absolute power never ever needs to raise its voice or actively celebrate the absolute demise of a completely pathetic, weak enemy. I simply wanted to deliver one final silent message to the arrogant boy who had dared to violently place his cowardly hands on my beautiful, brilliant daughter. I walked smoothly into the sterile, cold visitor center of the federal jail, wearing a completely simple, elegant gray suit. The room smelled of harsh chemical bleach and absolute pure human despair. I sat down calmly in a hard plastic chair directly in front of a thick, smudged glass partition. A few moments later, a heavy metal door clicked open loudly, and Preston was slowly led into the small visitation booth by a large, armed corrections officer. He looked absolutely terrible. His skin was incredibly pale and completely covered in unhealthy blemishes. His hair was entirely unkempt and wildly overgrown. He had lost a significant amount of weight, and his orange prison jumpsuit hung awkwardly loosely on his completely defeated, shaking frame. He sat down heavily in the chair across from me, picking up the heavy black plastic telephone receiver with completely trembling fingers. I slowly, gracefully picked up my own telephone receiver and held it completely calmly to my ear. Preston stared at me through the thick, dirty glass, his pale blue eyes entirely filled with a mixture of absolute pure hatred and profound, overwhelming exhaustion. "You completely destroyed my entire life," he whispered, his voice sounding incredibly weak and entirely broken through the terrible static of the prison telephone system. "You took absolutely everything from me, Evelyn. My entire company is completely gone. My beautiful parents are entirely homeless. I am facing 20 long years in a federal penitentiary. Are you finally completely happy now?" I looked at him with an expression of absolute, complete, cold indifference. I did not feel a single tiny ounce of sympathy for his pathetic, miserable situation. I did not speak a single word to him. I simply reached my hand into my elegant leather handbag and slowly pulled out a freshly printed glossy magazine. It was the absolute newest monthly edition of the most highly respected, prestigious national business magazine in the entire country. I slowly raised the glossy magazine and pressed the beautiful, colorful front cover directly flat against the thick, smudged glass partition so he could read it absolutely perfectly clearly. Featured entirely prominently on the glorious front cover was a stunning, incredibly beautiful, high-resolution photograph of my completely brilliant daughter, Maya. She was sitting confidently behind the massive mahogany desk in the sprawling corner office of Lumina Innovations. She was wearing a stunning, incredibly sharp, custom-tailored business suit, her dark eyes completely radiating absolute, pure, terrifying global corporate power. The massive, bold text printed directly across the glossy cover read entirely clearly, "Meet Maya Sterling, the brilliant new visionary, Chief Executive Officer, rebuilding Lumina Innovations from the dark ashes of absolute corporate corruption." She had completely legally and entirely rightfully taken over the massive multi-billion-dollar technology company he had so completely foolishly lost. She was not just completely surviving his terrible, horrific abuse, she was absolutely entirely thriving in ways he could never even possibly begin to comprehend. Preston stared directly at the beautiful magazine cover, his pale, completely defeated eyes growing incredibly wide with absolute, pure, terrifying, horrific realization. His shaking hands completely dropped the heavy black plastic telephone receiver, allowing it to swing loudly and awkwardly against the cold metal wall of the small visitation booth. He suddenly, finally, entirely understood the absolute massive scale of his total, complete, permanent failure. He had not just lost his massive wealth and his precious freedom. He had been completely, entirely, permanently replaced by the very woman he had arrogantly told was absolutely nothing without him. He was entirely erased from the successful corporate world forever. I kept the glossy magazine pressed firmly against the thick glass for exactly 1 full minute, ensuring that every single beautiful, glorious detail of Maya's incredible, massive success was permanently burned directly into his pathetic, broken memory forever. Then I slowly, calmly pulled the magazine away from the glass. I placed it very carefully back into my elegant leather handbag. I did not say goodbye. I did not offer him a single tiny parting word of advice or completely unnecessary closure. I simply stood up from the hard plastic chair, turned my back completely, entirely on him, and walked gracefully, smoothly out of the cold, sterile visitation room. I walked directly out into the bright, warm, beautiful Atlanta afternoon sunshine, entirely leaving him completely trapped inside his dark, cold concrete prison cell forever. The incredibly long, dark, terrible nightmare was now absolutely, completely, officially over. My brilliant, beautiful daughter was incredibly safe, immensely wealthy, and absolutely, entirely free to build her own glorious, magnificent empire. The absolute, complete devastation of the Whitman family was not just a simple matter of losing massive financial assets. It was the complete, systematic dismantling of their entire fabricated reality. For decades, they had operated under the completely false assumption that their massive generational wealth permanently insulated them from the basic fundamental rules of human decency. They had built their entire social identity on the completely false premise that they were inherently entirely superior to everyone else around them simply because they possessed a massive bank account and a highly recognizable last name. By completely stripping them of their massive financial resources, I had entirely removed the only tiny thin layer of protection they ever truly possessed. Without their massive money, Richard and Susan Whitman were finally completely exposed to the entire world as the incredibly bitter, highly insecure, and deeply racist people they had always truly secretly been. The tiny rundown apartment on the South Side was not just a massive financial downgrade for them, it was a highly appropriate, perfectly fitting, absolute permanent psychological prison. They were now entirely surrounded by the very hard-working, humble people they had spent their entire lives viciously mocking and completely looking down upon. Every single day they were forced to confront their own massive, complete irrelevance in a world that had entirely, completely moved on without them. Chloe, too, was learning a completely terrible, harsh lesson about the absolute true nature of corporate power and massive greed. She had foolishly believed that aligning herself with a corrupt, wealthy executive would automatically guarantee her a permanent position in the highest echelons of Atlanta high society. She had happily traded her basic human morals for a completely stolen vintage diamond necklace and an illegally purchased luxury downtown penthouse. But stolen wealth is incredibly fragile, entirely temporary, and entirely easily destroyed. Now, as she wiped down sticky coffee counters and swept the dirty floors of the local barista shop, she was entirely forced to live with the heavy, massive, permanent shame of her terrible actions. She had absolutely no high society friends left to call. She had absolutely no massive corporate salary to protect her from the harsh, cold realities of basic daily survival. She was entirely, completely alone, permanently trapped in a completely miserable, lowly existence of her very own making. As I drove my completely normal, reliable Honda Sport utility vehicle back toward my quiet, peaceful suburban home, I felt a profound, immense sense of deep, absolute satisfaction completely wash over me. The massive, elaborate financial trap I had so carefully and meticulously constructed over the past several difficult, stressful days had worked entirely, absolutely perfectly. I had successfully, completely protected my incredibly beautiful, brilliant daughter from a massive, terrible, looming threat, and I had entirely, permanently neutralized the arrogant, corrupt, evil monsters who had dared to try and completely ruin her incredibly bright, beautiful future. The shadow chairwoman had completely successfully finished her massive required work. It was finally time to return to my quiet, peaceful, beautiful garden. 6 months have passed since that unforgettable night at the grand corporate gala. The massive storm that completely swept through our lives has entirely settled, leaving behind a beautiful clear sky. Today, the towering glass and steel skyscraper of Lumina Innovations looks exactly the same from the outside, but the entire world inside those massive walls has fundamentally changed forever. Preston is completely gone. His dark, toxic legacy has been entirely erased from the corporate history of the building. In his place, sitting confidently behind a beautiful new collaborative workspace, is my brilliant daughter, Maya. She did not keep the massive, intimidating mahogany desk that Preston used to make himself feel powerful. She completely redesigned the massive corner office to reflect her own beautiful, inclusive vision. The room is now filled with bright, natural light and vibrant, colorful paintings created by the incredibly talented children from her community art center. She completely transformed the dark, oppressive corporate culture into a thriving environment of genuine mutual respect. When Maya officially took over as the new chief executive officer, she immediately reinstated David as her primary chief financial officer. Together, they completely rebuilt the entire executive leadership team, entirely removing the arrogant, selfish men who had previously enabled Preston's massive corporate embezzlement. The employees who used to walk through the hallways in absolute terrifying fear now hold their heads incredibly high. They are completely valued and generously compensated for their incredibly hard work. Maya seamlessly integrated her deep passion for community service directly into the massive corporate structure. Lumina Innovations now completely funds multiple community art centers across the entire city, providing safe creative spaces for thousands of struggling children. She proved to the entire global financial market that a company can be incredibly, massively profitable while still maintaining absolute basic human morality. She is a completely brilliant visionary leader, and the anonymous board of directors, meaning me, could not possibly be any more incredibly proud of her absolute massive success. As for me, I have completely happily returned to the quiet, peaceful life I always truly loved. I am standing outside right now in my beautiful, modest suburban backyard. The warm, bright Atlanta sun is shining perfectly down on my blooming rose bushes and my vibrant blue hydrangeas. I am wearing my favorite faded denim overalls and my wide-brimmed straw hat. My hands are completely covered in rich, dark potting soil. I do not miss the massive high-stakes corporate boardrooms or the incredibly stressful billion-dollar financial acquisitions. I completely built Sterling Vanguard in the absolute dark shadows specifically so I could eventually return to the beautiful bright light of my simple, peaceful garden. I never truly wanted to be a famous, highly public billionaire. I only ever wanted to be a completely, fiercely protective, loving mother to my beautiful, brave daughter. Sometimes when the afternoon breeze blows perfectly through the green trees, I think about the completely terrified look on Preston's face when the federal agents dragged him violently out of the grand ballroom. I think about Richard and Susan Whitman completely trapped in their tiny, rundown apartment, entirely suffocated by the massive, crushing weight of their own terrible, arrogant choices. I do not feel a single tiny ounce of pity for any of them. They absolutely entirely earned every single bit of their massive, total, permanent destruction. They completely mistook my intentional, quiet humility for absolute, helpless weakness. They truly believed that because I did not proudly wear heavy, expensive diamonds or loudly boast about my massive bank accounts, I was simply an easy, pathetic target. They entirely learned the absolute hardest, ultimate lesson in the entire world. You see, the truly powerful people in this world never ever have to loudly announce their massive presence. They do not need to constantly tear down innocent people just to build up their own fragile, massive egos. True, absolute power is incredibly quiet. It is deeply, incredibly patient. It sits entirely calmly in the dark, waiting absolutely perfectly for the exact right moment to entirely strike. I completely watched them dig their own massive graves with their own terrible, arrogant hands. I completely provided the heavy shovels, and they happily did all the incredibly hard manual labor entirely by themselves. I want to speak directly to you right now. I want you to listen to my voice very carefully. Throughout your entire life, you will undoubtedly encounter people who are exactly like Preston and exactly like his deeply cruel parents. There will always be arrogant, entitled people who will look down on you simply because of where you come from or how much money you currently have in your bank account. They will constantly try to tell you that you are absolutely nothing without them. They will actively attempt to completely use your beautiful, gentle grace as a heavy weapon directly against you. They will try to make you feel incredibly small so they can pretend to be massively tall. When that terrible moment inevitably happens, I want you to completely remember my story. I want you to remember the quiet, humble mother standing in the garden who secretly completely owned the entire massive bank. Do not ever let their loud, arrogant voices completely drown out your own beautiful inner strength. Do not ever allow their completely fabricated illusions of massive power to make you doubt your own absolute profound worth. You do not need to scream or yell or throw completely pathetic public tantrums to fight back against their toxic abuse. You simply need to be incredibly smart, incredibly patient, and absolutely, entirely relentless. You must completely recognize your own inherent incredible value before anyone else can ever properly recognize it. Build your own massive strength entirely in the quiet shadows. Gather your absolute, undeniable evidence entirely carefully. Protect your precious peace and your beautiful mental health with absolutely everything you have inside of you. And when the absolute perfect moment finally arrives, you step directly, completely into the bright light, and you completely, entirely obliterate their false reality with the absolute, undeniable, crushing truth. Remember this incredibly important, vital lesson forever. The absolute, quietest women standing in the room usually completely hold the absolute, most terrifying, massive power. We are the fierce, protective mothers, the loyal, dedicated daughters, and the brilliant, unseen architects of entirely massive, successful empires. We observe absolutely everything, and we completely forget absolutely nothing. We are the beautiful calm before the massive, terrifying, destructive storm. Have you ever had someone completely mistake your genuine kindness for absolute, pathetic weakness? How did a fierce, protective mother's love help you completely successfully serve them their absolute, entirely deserved karma? I want to completely read every single one of your incredible personal stories. Drop your amazing stories directly in the comments completely below right now. Tell me exactly how you bravely stood up to the toxic, arrogant abusers in your own beautiful life. Tell me exactly how you brilliantly, completely turned the tables on the completely arrogant people who foolishly, entirely underestimated you. If you completely loved hearing exactly how we systematically, entirely destroyed Preston and his terrible, cruel family, please make sure you hit that subscribe button right now. Give this video a massive thumbs up, and please definitely share this incredible story with any woman who currently needs a powerful reminder of her own massive, incredible inner strength. Hit the notification bell so you never ever miss another powerful story of absolute, brilliant, righteous revenge and complete personal triumph. Never ever let anyone completely make you feel like a tiny, insignificant guest in your own beautiful, massive life. You are the absolute sole rightful owner of your own incredible destiny. You hold the absolute ultimate power to completely walk away from entirely toxic, deeply abusive environments and entirely build a completely brand new, beautiful reality entirely on your own terms. Thank you so incredibly much for completely joining me on this entirely satisfying, beautiful journey. Keep your beautiful head held incredibly high, keep your brilliant mind incredibly sharp, and please always absolutely remember to let your massive, brilliant success be your absolute loudest, ultimate, complete revenge. Please stay incredibly safe. Stay absolutely, entirely, incredibly strong. And please always entirely protect your beautiful, precious peace completely forever, today, tomorrow, and absolutely always. I want you to take this massive, beautiful, powerful lesson directly into your own entirely incredible daily life right now. Every single massive morning, when you wake up and look completely beautifully directly into your own mirror, I want you to remember absolutely, completely, exactly who you truly, undeniably are. You are a completely, absolute, massively fierce, unstoppable, incredibly, deeply powerful force of absolute true nature. Do not ever completely settle for absolutely anything less than you absolutely, totally, completely, entirely, rightfully deserve in this massively beautiful, incredible, entire world. We are building a massive, unstoppable, incredibly beautiful, empowering community entirely together here. Thank you again for your absolute, massive, unwavering, endless support.